Alright guys, Willem here, back with a new video, and we're finally here with the final part of my ranking of every Big Brother player. We're at the top 80 of the list. We're finally getting to the good / actually great players by the end of it, which, I mean, truth be told, in the grand scheme of Big Brother, I don't feel like there's that many, but again, we'll talk about them here. So let's jump right back into the list. At number 80, we are moving on to a player I'm a bit rocky about. I do feel like this person definitely has some pros to their game, though I still question their overall game ability in the grand scheme of things. So at 80, I do have Christy Murphy from BB21, and Christy's a player that does get very emotional at points. I mean, she is someone that does seem to get extremely paranoid and does some pretty illogical things in the game, though at the same time, again, there are things to really hype her up. I mean, the fact that she, again, was in the majority alliance for the first half of the game, and obviously that does crumble with the 6 shooters breaking up, but even then, I mean, she's able to still survive when she's initially the target, where you have the entire Taco Tuesday incident, and then proceeds to be kept around for a few weeks after that. Now, to be fair, I mean, some of the things that save her towards the end of the game is her connection to Tommy, which was an out-of-the-game relationship, but I still think they would have been really close in the house too. So I don't think that's like the end-all be-all of her game. And again, for her to make it the final 6, where she had this like pretty big target on her back by the time of the final 10, again, is pretty impressive. And again, I think as a whole, again, I think there is some decent gameplay there. Again, she does save herself during the final 9 round, though beyond that, again, like, it was someone that was very emotional in the game. Again, would talk about targeting her own allies, where she talked about targeting Jack early on, which was kind of dumb. Also, her constant flip-flopping during her first HOH was not great, but still overall, I think a competent player, one that, again, did some impressive things at points, and that's why she's here number 80. At number 79, we're moving on to a player that had a very unique strategy in the game, and while there definitely are qualms we had with this person, I do feel like they played a pretty innovative game, and that person is Spencer from BB15. And I think Spencer is an interesting player on this season, one that, and early on, was part of the moving company. They were in the middle of things, though obviously that crumbles by the time of week 2, though I think of the people that do end up flipping, he does probably one of the better jobs at it, where he ends up getting ahead of it a bit better than the likes of Howard, where Howard gets a lot more of the brunt of the blame for that flip than Spencer does. And beyond that, again, like, Spencer is still on the bottom, though, again, is not really the target ever. I mean, he is constantly used that as a pawn, and again, actively so, to where he puts himself in this position in a way to gain trust with people, which, again, you could definitely qualm with that strategy, where, again, you would obviously not want to be put up on the pawn. So again, he's pretty much on the block almost every eviction from week 5 onwards, to which, again, it was pretty impressive to see, like, the amount of leverage he was able to gain through volunteering himself. And again, in the end game, he ends up forming the Exterminators with Andy, and they end up running a lot of the end game, to where, again, he gets the final 3 with, again, a winning scenario in going to the end of Gina Marie. So again, he had a winning scenario by the end. Again, I think his navigation of the game is interesting, with his back, like, third of the game being very impressive, actually, and him running the game alongside Andy. Though, again, I think he lacked win equity, and he also lacked much ability to even win the final HOH, which is something he would have needed to win the game anyway, to where, again, like, there definitely are criticisms to be had here, but I think as a whole, a pretty savvy player in the grand scheme of things, and for me, he's here number 79. At number 78, we're moving on to a player that is from the most recent season of the show, this being a player that has a lot of pros, but also has a lot of cons, and that person is Corey Wurtenberger from BB25. And Corey is a player that, when he was good, he was very good. He plays a very, like, Kevin Jacobs light style game early on, and him being able to ride the middle and gain information along the way, and then eventually pick the time to strike and utilize that information to completely flip the house. Again, all that is very solid. The problem is that after he does that, he simply just doesn't really take full reins of the game. He kind of lets go of the gas after he pulls off the big move. So he mismanages his relationship with Bowie. He plays too much to Matt and Jag's favor, to where, I mean, too fair, again, like, would he have been able to get Matt and Jag out anyway? Probably not. Again, they won all the comms. Though, again, I still think a better player would have probably still kept Bowie Jane on his side, still kept Cameron on his side, not had the likes of a Blue having a one-sided rivalry with him. But still, I mean, I do think there are definitely very impressive aspects of his game. I mean, the fact that he was a person that Jared, Izzy, and Sri were seemingly loyal to at points in the game. He was definitely the person that they were leaking a lot of information to, which obviously let him make that move that he made at week 6. The fact that he stopped the Isom backdoor, which was very beneficial for his game. Even after his game really starts to crumble, I still think he does some good work in pulling Matt and Jag in enough to where they don't target him. Again, there's still some misguided moves throughout the season, but I still think he's a strong enough player to where he's still here at number 78. At number 77, we're moving on to a player that I also think is extremely flawed. They had a good chunk of win equity by the end, and also were playing well at a point, and that person is G from BB4. And G is a player that, straight up, I mean, if you watch just the show, I don't think you fully pick up on what G was doing in the game, but G was a player that was actually playing the middle pretty well for the middle stretch of the game. Again, he had been obviously attached to the Stooges, and the show really just hyper focuses on his relation with the Stooges and makes it as if he would have never backstabbed them in the game, when in reality he was working on going against them. Again, setting up this like plot to take out Justin and throw the HOH to allow Justin to go home. Which, I mean, to be fair, I don't know if it was really the best timing for it. He did it at Final 7. That wasn't that optimal. Along the fact that he also, like, regrets doing this by the time it happens and is very flaky during Justin's final week. But still, I mean, like, he was playing the middle pretty well. Again, alongside June. Again, they were working together in tandem in the middle of the game. While G was, again, the safest person of the three Stooges, they were targeting both Justin and Robert over him for most of the season. So, again, like, there's definitely things to qualm with. Again, the fact that he was pretty aloof in week 2 and puts up Michelle as a pawn only for her to go home. His end game is pretty bad, to where, again, he's really just making himself a bigger target by just winning comps when he doesn't need to and getting really cocky at that point in the game. But again, I do think there is that middle stretch that is actually pretty good gameplay from him, to where he was one of the safest people in the entire house. To where, again, for me, because of that, and along with the fact that, again, I do think he wins if he gets to the end. Like, really, by the time he gets booted, I think his only jury threat is potentially Erica. But even in that situation, he has 3 pretty locked in jury votes, and is probably likely to get G and maybe even Allison in that spot. So again, I do think he was a very likely winner if he had gotten to the end. It's just that obviously I think he messed it up for himself to make himself such a big target by the end. So because of that, for me, he's here number 77. And number 76, moving on to a player from BB20. This one being part of the major majority alliance for the entire season, though was also cut by them a bit early, and that person is Brett. And again, Brett, I think, is an interesting player in the sense that, again, he was in the Majority Alliance. He was a pretty active participant within the Majority Alliance. Again, he was definitely doing things that benefit level 6. Where, I mean, at first he was their massive figurehead that the other side was going after, that they would just keep in the game so that he could be the scapegoat for them. But even then, he would cause these fights that would mask who exactly was at fault for certain votes. He does some pretty decent work during the Fessy HOH, where he plays a factor in Fessy fully believing that Scotty was the one to flip his vote. Again, I do think there are things he does well, while also being in the Majority Alliance for really 2/3 of the season. The problem is obviously at the very end, he kind of drops the ball. I mean, while he did build this final 2 with Tyler, he was a bit too loyal to it, especially when he should have known that Tyler had better connections with Casey and Angela. And to be fair, I mean, he never really had the chance to make the move. He never won an HOH to really do much about it. And really, I don't feel like he was ever turning on level 6, and Tyler especially. So I think that was definitely bad for his game. Along with the fact that I don't know how likely he is to win the game. Again, if he got into the end, and he probably beats Angela, but is that about it? I think it's like maybe close between him and Tyler, but I do think he struggles in terms of win equity, especially considering how much the Falte side of things did not love him from the very beginning. But again, I do think he was a pretty active player. He was one that played pretty well at points. The problem is that he was playing well for a group that he was always on the bottom of. But again, for me, I still feel like his active enough play is enough to land him here at number 76. Number 75, moving on to another person for BB20. This person being better in the sense that they were higher on the power structure than Brett, but worse in the fact that I think there's 0 chance this person wins the game, and that person is Angela. And again, Angela, despite being very well positioned for a lot of the game, I don't think there was really many points where she was in danger. I mean, at least not until post-jury, to where by that point, her side just continuously won the comp. So there's never really much of an opportunity to take her out outside the final 10 round, where, to be fair, I mean, she has got saved by the hacker twist to a degree, to where, again, that's definitely something to qualm with her game as well. But again, she was in a pretty good spot early on, pretty well ingrained within her side of the house, and then obviously builds a really strong bond with Casey and Tyler that really allows her to really just blow through the game as they just won comp after comp after comp. That allowed them to get the final 4 pretty unfettered. Now, obviously, the issue is the fact that Tyler, her closest ally, was always more loyal to Casey, despite the fact that it was against his own best interest, which is kind of insane there, to where, and that's definitely a knock against her. Also, again, she doesn't win at the end. I don't think she beats anybody. I mean, maybe Sam, but even then she wasn't going to take her, to where, again, I don't think Angela is winning this game. So I think those are 2 pretty major flaws. But again, the fact that she was in the Majority Alliance for pretty much the entire season, also being well ingrained within that alliance, and also being a solid comp competitor, for me, it's enough to put her here at number 75. And then number 74, we're moving on to a player that actually made it to the end, a runner-up of the show, but one that I do question their overall game ability, because I do think the first half of their game is pretty strong, but then their second half was not as strong, and that person is Holly from BB21. And again, for me, Holly was playing pretty well at the beginning of the game. I think when the Grateful Alliance and the 6 shooters were in play, and she was very well positioned in the game, where again, she was well liked, no one was targeting her. However, once the 6 shooters blows up, which, well, again, you can definitely fault a lot of that with Jackson. I think her connection to Cat plays a factor as well, along with the fact that I think she gets benefited from the fact that she has the connection to Cat. And Holly does a decent amount of damage control in the game. I mean, she's still not in a particularly great spot following this, to where, while Jackson's definitely being targeted over her, Jackson pretty much ends up being her only, like, true ally in the game following this, to where, again, they do eventually make a final 4 with Nicole and Cliff that allows them to have an easier ride through the game, though is still, again, in this position where they're largely revolving around comps. And I think it's this point in the game where, for me, I do really sour on Holly's game. Not just because obviously her game is very reliant on comps of her and Jackson just going back to back, but more so the fact that I feel like she becomes less strategically active in the game. I mean, outside of her targeting of Nick, I do feel like she really just starts to let Jackson just do everything. Most of the time getting his way in terms of how they're navigating through the game, and them siding with the likes of Cliff, which was a connection that Jackson had a lot more than Holly did. But also, she just becomes a lot less present figure in the game, where again, at the final 5, where she's in danger and almost goes home, and she does really nothing to save herself in that position. Again, it is largely Jackson, and by the grace of Jackson that she survives that round, and even then proceeds to throw the final 4 HOH in agreement with the deal that they made the following round, which is dumb, as it obviously puts her in way more danger, now giving Cliff and Nicole a potential other person to vote out other than Jackson had they won the veto, which, to be fair, I think at the end of the day they still would have cut Jackson, but it's still a dumb move for Holly to even go through with that, especially considering Jackson did have a closer bond to Cliff in particular, while again, she also would have taken Jackson to the end had she won final HOH and then lost to him, which, to be fair, while she would have probably lost against Nicole as well, again, I do think she would have had a better chance against Nicole. So again, I think at the end of the day, like, I just feel like her end game is one that is her just kind of backing down from how she played the game previously and really just going all in on Jackson, despite the fact that Jackson's someone that was the more active participant in the game and the one that would beat her at the end, which, I mean, to be fair, I guess you could argue the fact that maybe she thought she could win due to a bitter jury, but I felt like it was pretty clear, when even watching this season, that this jury was one that was very much trying to reward the best winner, especially after what happened with BB's 19 and 20. All the fact that I don't think she beats anybody at the end, realistically. Again, she loses to Jackson. I think she loses to Nicole. I think she loses to Cliff. She loses to Tommy. I think Christy is close. But again, you do have to go pretty far back to look for someone that she actually can beat in the game. I really just feel like Holly's endgame is pretty misguided, to where while she did play a good first half of the game, I do feel like her back half is pretty lackluster. And because of that, for me, she is here at number 74. Now, number 73, we're moving on to a player that I think when you see this person on paper, most people probably think of this person as a pretty bad player. However, there's a reason they're this high, and that person is Danielle Murphy from BB14. And obviously, Danielle is someone that, again, wasn't the most pleasant person in the house. I mean, she's the type of person that is, again, pretty mean-spirited to people, would say things behind their backs, would also just say some pretty crazy things. However, Danielle Murphy comes extremely close to winning the game. For again, she literally gets to final 3 in a position where I think she does beat both Dan and Ian. I mean, obviously Dan is pretty easy to assume there, but against Ian, even then, I think she does have the votes of Shane, Jen, and Frank pretty locked in, to where she really just needs one more. And again, I think it's very likely that Joe votes for her. There's even obviously the chance that Dan votes for her. Like, really, I feel like she was one comp win away from winning the entire game there. Now, again, like, as a whole, obviously she was still being manipulated by Dan. I mean, obviously we have the final 4 situation where Shane ends up getting taken out, even though in retrospect, even though it does obviously make Danielle look really dumb, I don't think it's actually entirely bad for Danielle, as Shane was someone that she couldn't beat, to where, while if she gets to the final 3, she's guaranteed final 2, she also easily loses to Shane, where again, in the final 3 she actually ends up with, again, I think she beats both of them, so at least that's something. Obviously that wasn't intentional, but even beyond that, again, I do think she ends up building really strong bonds with a lot of the end gamers. Again, Jen in particular, someone that she was really close to, obviously had a close relationship with Dan and Brittany, obviously Shane, and again, was in the majority alliance for most of the game. I mean, after week 3, she's essentially in a pretty powerful position alongside Dan, Shane, and Brittany, with them being the true core of the house while having all these other offshoots with the likes of Boogie and Frank and Ian. And really, they just like easily steamroll the rest of the game from that point forward. So the only adversity is Frank. But even then, I mean, during Frank's HOH where he targets Dan, like she was never really in danger. She was always a pawn on the block. It was never really going home to where, again, like I think she was very safe throughout a lot of the game, was pretty good at competitions while also having a lot of win equity to where, again, like I think at the end of the day, how much of that was intentional, but I do feel like her game is one that, again, was so close to being a winning game because for me, it is here at number 73. Now, number 72, we're getting to our first winner, finally, and we're actually having 4 winners in a row here. Let's start all that off with Evil Dick, who, again, I've been pretty outspoken about this. I think Evil Dick is a pretty bad player. Like, while he did win, he obviously wins due to America's Player, and I do think if America's Player was not in play, he would have really no shot on that season. And even with that, again, it still had him relying on comp wins by the very end, and him having to get to the one specific final 2 situation where he wins against Danielle, where he probably loses against literally everybody else. So again, I think Evil Dick is a terrible winner. However, again, he's still a winner. I mean, I really wanted to put Dick lower on this list. However, I do feel like, again, when looking at the board, really just most Big Brother players are bad. And when taking that into account, again, I do feel like even the worst winner here is still relatively high on this list. Where, again, like we're going to be talking about people even coming up, where I still don't even think they're that good of Big Brother players, yet they're still high on the list simply because, again, of the prestige of their placements to where the true reality is that, again, most Big Brother players are bad. Most people don't know what they're doing. Most people make massive mistakes in the game. To where I would really only quantify probably like the top 17 or so of this list as like the truly great Big Brother players. Well, everyone else is a pretty flawed player. And even then, those people at the top still have their flaws. To where, again, Evil Dick being at 72 here is really just kind of a circumstance of the fact that most people are bad. To where, again, I think Evil Dick is bad. Again, he, while at points can be good socially with certain people, he still is this figure that is pretty hated by a good chunk of the house. He treats people terribly. He can be competent strategically, but in most cases has no real acumen to actually pull any of that off. And I just think he's the type of person that, again, like, is he ever going to win Big Brother again if he were to play again? No. I think his one winning scenario was what we got of a very luck dependent game that was predicated with America having a major say in how the game played out, and had one of the best players in the house not be able to make his own moves in the game. To where, again, I do not think Evil Dick is that good of a player, but because he's a winner and because of there being minor pros to his game, again, it's enough to put him here at number 72. Now, number 71, another winner that I also don't think is actually that good of a player. I did have higher on this list at one point, but then when I actually thought through their games, I just feel like it was tough to put him much higher, and that person is Rachel Riley. And Rachel Riley is obviously a massive legend of the game. I mean, one that is such a notable character in the history of the show. Again, as a player, I think it's very tough to really praise her too much. Again, like her first appearance is one where she's instantly on the outs from the very beginning, is being targeted by the majority of the house, wins comps to get to 9th place, and is eventually taken out there in a spot where most of the house hated her. She then returns for BB13, where once again, a lot of the house hated her. Though again, she comes into that season in a very fortunate position with the vets on her side, and even despite that, becomes a big target by week 4. Brendan ends up saving her with the veto. So again, she's going to be booted week 5 and gets saved by Lawan quitting the game, which was due to them announcing by Lawan asking to be voted out, which was due to them announcing a twist beforehand. And following that, I mean, her game is one where she essentially has to win out from Final 6 on. And while obviously people bring up Pandora's Box, and her getting the exact same comp at the Final 6 that she won in week 1, those are definitely things to point out as like things that, again, could have been rigged for her, but I still think she probably just ends up getting her way to the end even without Pandora's Box based on how the comps play out. But again, it's still a game that is reliant on comps, along with the fact that she is reliant on her relationship with Portia that gets her through the Final 4 round, which is something to minorly credit her there for. But still, like Rachel just doesn't play that well on either of her seasons. So where, while I do think she could potentially play better now, I think she has a better understanding of the game now. I think she is definitely a lot less hot-tempered than she was at the time. I feel like it's tough to really assess her based on that when we haven't seen any of that yet. To where, because again, I do think Rachel's still a very sloppy player based on what we've seen, and because of that, for me, she's here at number 71. Now, number 70, another winner I also don't think is actually that good of a player, but they won the game, and there are, again, good things to point out, and that person is Ian Terry from BB14 and 22, who again, Ian is a player that obviously knows the game very well. I mean, Ian is obviously a massive super fan, or at least was. To where, again, coming into BB14, he was very knowledgeable about the game. The problem is that I feel like he's obviously very awkward socially, to where at first people didn't particularly like him. Again, he probably would have gone home week 1 had it not been for the coach's comp that gave him safety. But beyond that, again, I think he also plays it just outright terrible game on that season, to where while he's not really targeted for a lot of the early game, he's never really in that good of a spot, not really involved in the main power structure. And eventually he does end up joining the Quack Pack with Dan, Brittany, Shane, and Danielle, but he was actually always at the bottom of that. And that was never even really a true alliance. The true alliance was the core 4. He was simply just a number being used by them, to where he does end up taking out Boogie in a spot where, like, it's not even good for his game to take out Boogie. Yeah, he's the one that gets all the credit for it, also a lot of the blame for it. And really from that point on, he wins out. He's literally only in danger at the final 4 round from that point on, in a position where he's probably a goner at final 8 had he not won that special veto achievement in itself. Again, he won a twist veto that was added to the game. Or had he not won that, again, I think he's gone there. I think Frank for sure targets him over Brittany. Is probably targeted at any of the rounds following that had he not won HOH or veto. Again, literally is targeted at the double eviction, almost goes home there. And I think Dan would have targeted him again at the final 5 had he not won HOH. And we get to the final 4 where, again, he's saved simply by the fact that Shane and Danielle are both still in the game. There's showmance that you have to split up. But at that point, at the final 3, he throws part 1 of the HOH to Dan, which is still insane. And I had spent this entire endgame thinking that Dan was his true ally when Dan was always playing him and was actually targeting him for a lot of the game. And again, like, Ian just plays a terrible game. One where, again, he's so aloof in what's actually going on. And then mixing that with the fact that on BB22, he simply just doesn't do anything that, well, there either, again, also is left outside the initial power structure. And while, again, he is, like, kind of attached to them as, again, Nicole has a relationship outside the game with him, he never was able to really do anything in the game. And while at points he seems to finally pick up on the power structure and, like, tells Kaser about it, he doesn't really actually do anything about it. And while, again, I do think he gets taken out due to very unlucky circumstances at the point that he does, he simply was always poised to just be fodder for that main majority alliance to eventually cut him at some point with him being really expendable. Or again, I just think Ian is not that good of a player. For a while, again, he is a very likable presence. I like Ian. It's just that he's pretty much failed at almost everything he tries to do. And again, won his first time completely out of luck. To where, again, for me, I do look at him as one of the worst winners as a player, to where for me, he's here at number 70. Number 69, same thing. Another winner, a winner I do look at as a pretty mediocre player, but still one that won the game and definitely has major acumen in a certain aspect of the game. And that person is Jag from BB25. And again, I've critiqued Jag's game a lot as well, where, again, Jag, terrible player, was evicted early on and had to come back, and again was almost evicted once again the following week, and then was almost again nominated the exact same way he was in his boot week, because he simply would not leak the information he had, again essentially making the same mistake twice, which is all funny. Along the fact that, again, at the end of the game he was going to take Matt to the end, despite the fact that he thought he was going to lose to Matt and everyone had told him he was going to lose to Matt. Again, it's bad. But obviously there's a major aspect of the game that he is very dominant in, as the challenges. Again, he wins a ridiculous amount of competitions. Mind you, those competitions were ones that were very samey, and even then gets very fortunate the fact that there was this invisible HOH twist that allowed him to play in the HOH the following week, as it had not been for that. Again, I do think he probably gets taken out around the time to double, where, again, just straight up, I do feel like he was very obviously dependent on challenges, to where had he not won specific challenges, I do think he's out of the game at multiple points in the end game. Despite that, again, I think there are some good moments to his game. Again, him getting Matt to cut Suri, though even then, even in that position, I think the reason why Matt does it is because the clout that Jag was able to get due to his competition wins. He is able to pull over Bowie and being safer than Matt in the end game. Again, that's something, but really just as a whole, I think Jag's game is pretty terrible. But again, he still won a whole bunch of comps. He still won the game kind of accidentally, but he did. And for me, I think in comparison to someone like Ian, I just feel like Jag is someone that I would have more faith in on more appearances than them, to where I feel like Jag can find himself in a majority alliance more of the time than Ian. For me, that is like the minor difference here that puts Jag here number 69. Number 68, we're moving on to a player that is probably one of the earliest boots left on the board here. Someone that was actually taken out in 10th place on their season, but also someone that I think was pretty screwed over by how the house was laid out, where had it been a more natural power structure, I do feel like he would have been in a much better spot, and that person is Derek X from BB23. Again, it does feel a bit high for him, though I think the reality is, again, I think most players are bad. Where, again, had we been in this situation where the cookout did not exist, I do think DX is in a pretty good spot to just steamroll the game. I mean, he is someone that, had the cookout not exist, I do think he would have been part of the core alliance alongside Claire, Tiffany, and Hannah, to where I do think they would have run the game, to where even though, again, again, there definitely probably would have been a point where they would have thought about taking out DX. He's the type of player that is going to dominate these endgame comps. And had he gotten to the endgame stretch, I do think he probably just wins out at that point. To where, again, he's a very likely winner if he gets to the end. Like, really, I feel like DX is a very likely winner had it not been for the fact that the cookout existed. But obviously, with the play under context that the cookout did exist. So, where, again, he was aloof to that alliance, but then again, like, literally everyone on that season was. And even beyond that, I mean, like, there definitely are faults to be had with his threat management. Again, him winning a lot of comps early on and taking out Christian the way he does definitely does elevate his threat level. So considering the fact that I think Kylan also would have had a deep run in the other situation, I do think, again, it's not unreasonable to think that Kylan would have eventually cut DX along the way as well. And like, I think there's definitely qualms to be had, but I do think DX is the type of player that, again, if he were to play again, I think he would do extremely well. He seems to be pretty good socially, very good physically, and not a slouch strategically, especially now that he knows the game. Like, I mean, he seemed to be someone that like kind of picked up on the game as it went along, to where, yeah, I think DX is a pretty consistent player. And one that, again, could just steamroll the endgame comps. So, again, I would have a lot of faith in him coming back and doing extremely well there. And considering how wonky his original game was, for me, it's good enough to put him here at number 68. Now, number 67, we're moving on to a player that I think gets a bit overhyped as a really good Big Brother player, though still one that does have some major pros to their game, and that person is Jesse Goddards from BB's 10 and 11. It's where a lot of people talk about how much he like really steamrolled BB11, how much he was in control of things. However, I actually don't fully see it that way. Now, while again, I do think he does very good work in having a lot of control with the likes of like a Natalie, a Shima, a Lydia, and definitely does have a lot of clout at the very beginning. Mind you, again, he was handed the first HOH, and even then barely gets his target out in Brayden. He is in a pretty powerful position moving forward, but still, like, doesn't necessarily get his way where like Russell wins HOH and targets Ronnie, despite the fact that Jesse wanted to save Ronnie in that position. And obviously, like, you definitely mentioned the fact that, oh, he was only taken out due to coup d'etat, which is like a fair criticism, though I think when you look at it a bit deeper, I don't feel like he was in that good of a position even beyond that, where again, Russell more likely goes home there. Russell being actually probably one of the people that wanted to keep Jesse around the most. Well, also, at that point, he's essentially in the spot where he needs to win comps to make it further in the game, where again, Michelle wins the next HOH. She more than likely targets Jesse anyway, and Jesse's probably gone there unless he wins a comp. Even beyond that, again, Jeff and Jordan were targeting him. So if they won some of the future comps, as they did in real life, again, he probably goes in that situation as well. Where I don't think Jesse was that well positioned in the game, even if he had survived the coup d'etat. Especially considering the fact that Jesse himself wanted to keep Jeff and Jordan in the game and was targeting the likes of Kevin Campbell for Jeff and Jordan, which also, to be fair, Kevin Campbell was probably also going to target Jesse pretty soon as well. Where again, like, I think Jesse's overall positioning in that game was a bit overhyped, just largely due to the fact that he was obviously screwed over by the coup d'etat. But then even then, his BB10 game's not particularly good. I mean, it's one where he makes a target of himself from the very beginning, is on the block, obviously vetoes himself off, but still not a good position to be in it from the beginning. And again, while he does have his very strong group of allies, that group of allies are not really in a power position, where they end up getting targeted with Angie going home in week 3, and then Jesse's on the block against Memphis in week 4, to where obviously the vote flips on him, again, largely due to his own actions there. I think Jesse as a player in the grand scheme of things is a bit overhyped. However, again, considering how much control he had early on in BB11, and him always seeming to find himself in a pretty solid group of allies, it's enough for me to land him here at number 67. Now, number 66, another two-time player of the game, one that definitely has a lot of holes in his game, but definitely someone with a lot of acumen in his game, and that player is James Rhine from BB6 and 7, and James is obviously someone that's remembered as the veto king, the person that won 4/5 vetoes in BB6, while making it all the way to the final 7, where he's finally backdoored at that point in a spot where, again, it was very easy for you to backdoor someone, which, I mean, to be fair, I think James was essentially someone that was being kept around until the final 7, where everyone knew that they could backdoor him at that point. But still, I mean, like, it's still a very messy game in BB6, to where, like, pretty much all of his allies ended up turning on him, where initially he was working with Cappy then wanted to blindside him, so he flipped over to the Sovereigns, where eventually the Sovereigns end up turning against him. So from that point on, he's really just playing the middle and simply is, again, just kind of there simply because they know they could take him out later in the game, while they have these more bigger threats of these two warring sides going after each other for the short term. So again, I think his BB6 game is not particularly good. His BB7 game is also not the greatest, but it definitely has some more impressive aspects to it. Again, like, he's not just constantly winning out or just surviving by the skin of his teeth on that season. He has more established relationships there. Again, he is still part of the Sovereigns, even though he's the least trusted of that group. He also is working with the Legion of Doom, which, I mean, to be fair, that was a pre-game alliance, and that definitely plays a factor into why he was decently positioned here. But even then, despite that, again, he did talk about targeting Will in week 3, which obviously goes against that deal, so I mean, that's something. But still, I do think James plays a somewhat competent game on that season, to where even though he does end up in the same placement, I think his overall maneuvering through the game is more impressive impressive on that season, even though at the end of the day, again, he obviously gets outplayed by Chilton by the end of it. So again, he has 2 appearances, both making it the final 7, both having some pros to each of their games. So we're kind of at the point of the list where, again, just having 2 okay runs is enough to put you at this spot on the list. So because that for me, James is here number 66. Number 65, we're moving on to a player that might be a little bit underrated as a player, where I think they're commonly talked about as a great character, obviously having memorable fights in the game. However, I think they're also a solid player as well, and that person is Keisha from BB10. And I think Keisha in BB10 actually plays a somewhat decent game. Now, I think a major issue with Keisha for me is the fact that she doesn't necessarily get her way at points. I mean, early on, she has like the bond with Steven that gets cut right away. Her own alliance doesn't really seem to really care much about what she thinks. Though in April, targets Memphis, despite Keisha wanting to keep Memphis around. And like straight up, I do think she's probably the least integral of the Coven in how the early game plays out. However, I do think she's able to take that position and play pretty well from that afterwards. So where, again, she obviously orchestrates the Jesse blindside alongside Libra, which is impressive play. I mean, she's also like relatively safe early on, where again, like while she's not really getting much actively done on her own, she's still in a decent spot and does get her target out in week 3. So at least that's something. She, again, survives being targeted over Libra at the final 9. And from that point on, again, like her group just ends up steamrolling the comps to where, while she is definitely one of the bigger targets on her side, where I do think had the other side won HOH again, I do think she very much would have been in danger. I do think her maneuvering through the game at that point is pretty strong. Where again, like she does build this really strong bond with Memphis, really strong bond with Dan. So again, she's kept around over Rennie at the final 5, which I think is pretty impressive there. And while she is sniped out at 4, I do think she's someone that if she had gotten to the end, I think she definitely would have had some win equity. So while some people on the jury were definitely annoyed at her, I do think if she had gotten to the end against Jerry or Memphis, I think she at least stands a shot at winning there. So I do think her BB10 game is pretty solid. And I think her 22 game is one that, again, I can't really fault her that much for, considering how less second of an addition to the cast she was and how no one really knew who she was coming into that season, to where it felt like she was just kind of expendable due to that. It even then gets pretty unlucky in the fact that Kaser and Janelle have safety from the safety suite, to where it felt like she was a pretty easy target following that, to where I think she just largely gets unlucky on her return. But again, I think her first appearance is pretty strong, to where I think she is actively maneuvering through the game in a pretty interesting way. Though I still struggle putting much higher on this list, simply because, again, like I do feel like she was in a pretty precarious spot for the middle portion of the game, where had the other side won comps, I do think she would have at least been in some danger there. But again, for me, it is enough to land her here number 65. Now number 64, we're moving on to another 2-time player. Really, I mean, from this point on, we're having a lot of 2-time players. And at number 64, we do have Nokomis from BB5. And Nokomis is a player that I've openly talked about how overrated I do feel like Nokomis is. Again, she obviously gets a lot of credit for the creation of the backdoor, even though I don't feel like she really did much to get that credibility. Essentially just be the HOH at the time the plan went through, when she had very little to do with the formation of the plan. However, despite that, I do think Nokomis deserves some credit in other aspects of the game. I do think Nokomis is someone that was actually pretty good socially in the house. Again, she was well liked by the majority of the house and had a very solid core of allies on that season. And she had the Pinky Swear Alliance, and the Four Horsemen thought that they could pull Nokomis over to their side. To where, while she does start off the game in a very rocky position, simply due to the fact that she is someone that instantly feels like an outcast, again, I do think she's able to recover from that pretty well on this season. Also, she was pretty good at comps. Again, she won a good chunk of challenges along the way. Now, I will criticize her strategically. Well, again, I think there are some decent moments here and there, though I do think I will criticize her strategically. I do think strategically she wasn't the best player in the world. Again, simply being a bit lackadaisical in the game and blindly targeting the twins in spots where there are probably other bigger targets. Her being kind of aloof to the Drew and Diane relationship and how integral that will be in the game. Again, the fact that she doesn't target Drew at all in the end game is pretty insane to me. So I think there's definitely qualms to be had there. But again, I do think considering the spot that she came into that season, coming out of it, I think she ends up playing pretty well. Now, I think her second appearance is obviously not good on All-Stars, though to be fair, I think she was kind of doomed from the preseason. So just in general, BB5 was not very well connected coming into that season, and with season 6 just winning all the comps, again, it was pretty obvious that someone like her would go pretty early, but still, I don't really actually even factor her All-Stars appearance that much in her game. So for me, it is mostly her BB5 game, which again, I do think is strong, even though probably not as strong as some people claim. Though again, for me, it's enough to put her here at number 64. Now, number 63, we have a player that I don't particularly look at this person as that good of a player. However, they are someone with a very impressive track record, and that person is Erica from BB's 4 and All-Stars, to where, again, Erica has a very insane average placement here of a 4th place finish and a 2nd place finish. That is a almost unprecedented record, especially for people at this point in the list, where again, a lot of the players that have that high of a record are much higher on this list. However, again, I just don't actually look at Erika as that good of a player, where I do think Erika's BB4 game is one that is a bit rocky, and how she is attached to the likes of Jack and David and is part of the Elite 8, but once the Elite 8 crumbles, she's kind of just on the bottom, being kind of aloof at what's going on in the game. Obviously is targeted by the Stooges constantly, and is kind of kept around by the fact that like June and Allison want to keep her around to go after the Stooges, and really it just feels like she's like one of these sides that's being pitted against each other for a lot of that season, where eventually gets taken out for, which to be fair, I mean, she probably has a lot of win equity on that season. I mean, has she gotten to the end against anyone by the time of that Final Four, she probably ends up winning it, and it's obviously close between her and Robert, but I think she probably pulls out the win with the votes of June, Allison, Jack, and Nathan. While I will criticize her game there, I do think there is still some good aspects to it. Her BB7 game, though, is one where I think it's tougher to justify. I mean, while she is obviously a runner-up on that season, I don't think she plays particularly well to be a runner-up. Again, she's kind of just a floater for the early portions of the game, not really involved in much of what's going on, but again, not being targeted. And then by the middle portions of the game, she's largely just being manipulated by Chilltown into doing what they want. And she targets Danielle Reyes at Final 6, despite Danielle being her closest ally at that point. She is pretty much a dead man walking coming into the Final 4 round, which she does get pretty fortunate that Janelle wins the veto. And then again, she does do good work in pulling Janelle over, but obviously that was like also the kind of obvious move to make, to where really, I mean, I will give like Erika some credit there, but I also credit to more of just the sloppiness from Will and Boogie as well. But again, she's still in a pretty unwinnable position. I don't think she beats anybody in the end game outside of maybe Chicken George, and again, I think that's a major issue there, to where, like, again, I think her first game is one that at least she could win, but I think her navigation through the game is pretty poor, while her second time around, she navigates through the game a bit better, but is still never really involved in a major alliance. It's kind of just being manipulated through a lot of the game, and even when she finally does make a move, it's a move that, again, is in an unwinnable position. So because of that, for me, she's here number 63 and number 62. And here we're getting to one of the most popular players in the history of the show, one that I've commonly criticized their game, and I have a lot of people ask me, where's this person rank in the grand scheme of things? Well, here you go. At 62, I do have Janelle Pierzina, and yeah, Janelle obviously has 2 very deep runs on the show. Again, she gets 3rd place in BB6, 3rd place in BB7, appears again 2 times after that don't go as well, which, to be fair, I wouldn't really falter that much for those 2 appearances. Like, straight up, I think most of what ranks her this high is her first 2 appearances, with her not really being knocked that much for her 14 and 22 appearances, considering on both those seasons, she just had a massive target on her back that was pretty hard to escape. Now, technically, I do think she plays 22 a bit suboptimally in her targeting Tyler, despite Tyler being one of the few people that actually wanted to work with her. But still, again, like, I don't really qualm too much with those games, considering just how much things were stacked against her. But BB6 and BB7, I still think there are a lot of qualms to be had. While obviously a lot of people credit her a lot for her comp wins, and again, she is one of the best comp competitors of all time, she still doesn't really do much good with those competition wins. I mean, looking at her BB6 game, I mean, it's one where obviously she wins less comps in that season, but again, she's instantly on the bottom, gets saved by Kaser making the move that he does, informing the Sovereign 6, but even then loses Kaser right away, and has Howie make the move against James, which is just pretty much game ending for Janelle, where even at that point, even if she had made it to the end, she can't win the game, and she has almost no win equity on that season. Like, again, it's still like somewhat impressive the way she was able to navigate through the game, despite not having the numbers, but it's still a position where, again, she couldn't really even win the game on that season, and really, again, like, a lot of the Friendship Alliance just outright hated her, to where, again, I don't think it's a particularly good game. BB7, pretty much the similar thing, though definitely had more win equity. I think there are situations where Janelle wins, like had she gotten to the end against Erika, which, again, to be fair, she was very close to, and I do think she wins the game. I think if she gets to the end against Chicken George, I think she probably wins the game. However, I do think her win scenarios there are even then pretty limited, to where, again, I do think she outright loses against Will. I think she probably loses against Boogie, and really, like, I feel like she spends a lot of the game kind of just being manipulated by Chilltown, to where early on, I do think she's playing the game a bit emotionally, taking out these targets that are people that, like, don't like her. Now, I mean, to be fair, I think early on, while I have qualms with the fact that I do think she's targeting people for kind of emotional reasons, at the same time, these are people that are targeting her due to her reputation, and again, that is something to factor in there, the fact that she did have a pretty big target on her coming into it, but again, from the mid-game on, again, she's largely just being manipulated by Will. Again, she takes out Marcellus, which is something completely against her best interest. She loses Howie immediately following that. She is really just winning comps moving forward that allows her to navigate through the game, while Shieldstounder just kind of keeping her around as a shield. Now again, she does finally have a mind of her own and make the move against Will at Final Four, but even then, I mean, I think you could still even qualm with that move, in the sense that at least Will was someone that was easier to beat at the end, but still was not able to maintain the loyalty of Erica at the Final 3, which kind of nullifies that move to begin with. And again, like, I think Janelle's 2 games there are both one riddled with flaws, where she does make a lot of strategic errors across those seasons. Again, she's not particularly liked by a good chunk of the cast along the way as well, where also her comp wins were not really that well respected on the All-Star casts either, to where, again, I do not look at Janelle as that great of a player, but again, in the grand scheme of things, she's obviously higher than the people we've talked about so far. So because of that, for me, she is here at number 62. Now, number 61, we're moving on to a player that I do look at like somewhat similarly to Janelle. I think a step above her in the fact that she does beat her on one of the seasons, along with the fact that I do overall see more game acumen of this person. At number 61, I do have Danny Donato from BB8. And Danny is someone that, again, like, I do think her first run is like kind of comparable to a lot of Janelle's runs, in this spot where she's not particularly well liked by a lot of the cast. She does win a lot of competitions that gets her to the end of the game. Mind you, I do think Danny was obviously benefited due to America's Player, along with the fact that she had her dad in the game as well. But again, like, still gets to the end of the game, isn't well respected, doesn't win the game there. In a position where I think she's probably the biggest GOAT on the board. Following that, though, again, in BB13, she does try to play a bit more, plays a bit more aggressively, gets caught early on, but still, again, is very good at competitions, that is able to navigate her way to at least the final 8 round, where she's finally taken out there. Again, a pretty sloppy run, but one where she definitely does show her comp ability there. And then I think we get to BB22, where I think she actually probably plays her best game there. Again, she's in the dominant alliance from the very beginning, pretty much steamrolls with that alliance. The problem is that she's on the bottom of that alliance unknowingly for a lot of her run, really from like the midway portion of the game on. She's someone that is kind of a social pariah, and again, doesn't really make a move against them when she could have, though to be fair, again, they just win all the comps anyway, and she would have been booted along the way anyway. But still, I mean, I think the fact that she loses Nicole to Cody, the fact that she doesn't even keep Cody's loyalty, despite the fact that she was so blindly loyal to him, I think that's definitely a flaw there. But still, I think she has a more dominant appearance in BB12 than really any of Janelle's runs. Try mixing that in the fact that, again, I think her BB8 run is pretty comparable to Janelle's BB7 run, and in general, I do think I probably have more faith in Danny as a player than Janelle, especially in the modern day. I do feel like for me, it's barely enough to put her above her at number 61. Now, number 60, we're moving on to a player that I think is mostly impressive in the game. I think they are a very savvy strategic thinker, but at the same time, I think their actual game itself is a bit rocky, and that person is Matt Hoffman from BB12. And obviously, Matt was a member of the Brigade, and I think probably one of the most integral members of the Brigade, to where, while obviously the likes of like an Enzo was the one that actually get the group together, I do feel like Matt is very integral to the strategy they utilized on the season, to where this concept of having parachutes was an idea that, again, Matt came up with. That was pretty much the main pillar of the Brigade and what made them so successful. Now, beyond that, I do question a lot of the rest of his game, where while he was in this dominant alliance for a lot of the game, he also, again, makes some questionable moves, like getting himself nominated in week 2 and him trying to like turn it around on Rachel, which again was just easily found out that he was lying through that. Also in week 3, I mean, I don't really know what he was doing, where like obviously like something that is very impressive about Matt's game is that he was aware of the benefits of keeping Rachel and Brendan in the game as massive shields for the Brigade. But at the same time, it did seem like he actually did want to target Brendan and Rachel during that week, at least at a point, to where again he ends up failing at doing so. He would have been taken out at the final 8 had it not been for the fact that he had Diamond Power of Veto, and even beyond that gets taken out the following week, where I think his threat management really just sunk him by that point, to where again he was starting to win a whole bunch of comps. He was very blatantly being the person with the most connections outside of the Brigade, where he had a really good connection with Reagan, had a good connection with Brittany, where obviously sketched the Brigade out, to where again I think there definitely are flaws there. He really didn't manage his perception of the game particularly well, and came off as this like overtly schemy player. But again, I do give him a lot of credit for a lot of the success of the Brigade. Obviously he wasn't able to really capitalize on that, but still a solid player, well enough for me to put him here at number 60. Now, number 59, we're moving on to a player that is definitely a mixed bag. I think this is a person that people like to talk about as if he's a bad player, but I do think there are definitely a lot of impressive aspects to his game, and that person is Paulie Calafiore from BB18. And again, Paulie is a player that pretty much runs the first half of BB18. I mean, he is in such a dominant position throughout a lot of that game, is the person really taking control of the game, leading all the votes, approving all the plans. The problem is I feel like he gets a bit too cocky in the game, and I do feel like he really overreaches in the game and kind of fails at something that I think Cody does extremely well in BB22 of like realizing what battles are worth fighting, where it really feels like Paulie goes out of his way so much to just micromanage every little portion of the game. Again, even to the point where he puts himself on the block against Bridget to backdoor Devon, which is just kind of ridiculous. And again, he lets his power structure be known a bit too apparently. He's also just kind of a dick towards the end of the game, to where obviously the entire power structure flips against him. But again, he does play the first half of his game like extremely well, where it did seem like he was positioned well enough to just steamroll the rest of the game, especially considering how good at comps he was as well. Though again, he does blow it up for himself, which is definitely a qualm to have there. But really, I feel like the first half of Paulie's game on BB18 is probably more impressive than any of the people we've talked about so far in any portions of their games. So again, for me, again, while it is still a very rocky game, it is still enough for me to put him here at number 59. Number 58. We're moving on to another pretty dominant player for first like 2/3 of the season. Sure, while things go off the rails at the very end, I do think this person had a lot of control in how the game played out, and that person is Amanda from BB15. And again, Amanda really just ran a lot of that season. So really from week 2 on, she pretty much has a good chunk of control in the game. Again, in week 2, she does pull over McCrae, gets him to flip against Nick, really is a main catalyst for the moving company breaking up, which is pretty impressive. Following that, she again builds a number of alliances there, again having one with like Helen and Alyssa, having one with McCrae and Andy, having one with Judd, having one with Aaron. Like, she ends up really just being a central figure in the house from that point forward. And while again you could definitely qualm with how she acts in the house for sure, I do think she still had a lot of power in the game. Now, an issue also comes from jury management. Again, the jury did not particularly like her, to where if she had gotten to the end, I do think she struggles with winning a jury vote, though it's not impossible. But obviously she like leads the charge and getting rid of Helen, though then proceeds to be targeted herself, though again gets saved by the fact that Alyssa decides to not nominate her over McCrae, and that she uses the veto to save McCrae, only be targeted the following week anyways, where that's the point that obviously Andy flips on her. But again, I do think the first 2/3 of the game is one where she's in this very dominant position, essentially running the game, and had she been able to keep Andy in line, which again probably was never happening, she probably would have had a pretty smooth ride to the end of the game, but probably was never happening. And also her win equity was not the greatest, where again, there's definitely qualms to be had here. But for me, I think the level of control she had early on in the game is very impressive, and that's why she's here number 58. Now number 57, again, a player I look at pretty similarly from a very recent season, but one that obviously has a massive taint against them, and that person is Kyle from BB24. And the thing is, Kyle played a very impressive game up until his boot. The problem obviously comes from the controversy surrounding his boot, where his entire strategy of pulling together all the white people, essentially go after all the POC, and his inherent biases in that was, again, not good. Along with the fact that, again, like just inherently, even before all that happened, he was not doing particularly great with the jury. The jury did not particularly love him. But again, like I think when we look at his maneuvering through the game, it is very impressive. I mean, the way he was able to be very well positioned early on, be part of the initial power structure, but then proceed to flip that power structure in week 3 to a position where he's pretty much on the top of the entire game from that point on is very impressive. Now, I think a qualm to had is the fact that he didn't loop in Alyssa to this, to where I think because that does cause some problems by the time the final 11, whereas Alliance really wants to target Alyssa and he's able to stop it, but it does end up burning a lot of social capital for him. But again, at that point, he then flips against his own alliance, forms a new alliance that would have had the majority coming into the final 8 round, and again, it would have been in this position for him to completely run the game. The problem is that obviously that's when he gets caught with the tactics he's been utilizing, and through that obviously gets to this point where no one wanted to be associated with him and he gets taken out there. However, if that had not happened, he would have had pretty smooth sailing through the game, where again, his alliance was already going to be the majority following that round. They had already picked up Monty as a number, and to be fair, Monty probably actually goes, considering the comp results there. And also, I mean, to be fair, if Michael had won future comps, he was probably going to target Kyle. The question is, could he get Kyle out at that point? Again, that's questionable. It depends on who he's up against, but still, again, Kyle was in this very dominant position in the game. He just also was in a non-winning position in the game. Or again, even if he got to the end, I do find it tough to see him winning a jury vote even before his entire scandal happened. And obviously once that happened, he was just a goner. Or again, it's a rocky game, but I think in comparison to the people we just talked about, I do think he's on the same level of control as them, while also his vote off feels like a very wonky circumstance there, to where, again, it's enough for me to put him here at number 57. Number 56, we're moving on to a player that also was a pretty dominant player in the game, though to fair, I think this was a lot due to competitions and also how the show was currently laid out at that point. But either way, I do have Hardy from BB2, and Hardy, again, is a player that really just dominates BB2 alongside Nicole, where they really just win comp after comp after comp, really control pretty much everything going on. Though, again, I think a criticism to have there is that there was very few times where something could go wrong for him, considering the veto was not in play and through that couldn't shake up his nom. But at the same time, I think that is something that actually plays in his favor as well, where again, I think he probably wins the game had there been a veto in play, where at Final Four, he probably wins that veto, votes out Will, probably wins Final HOH and takes Nicole to the end where he probably beats her. Again, like I think that is also an argument to be made. So again, I think that kind of ends up equaling itself out. But even then, again, was a very dominant player throughout a lot of it. I do think he was being outplayed by Nicole for a lot of it, where Nicole was playing the middle a bit more, but at the same time, Nicole had less win equity than him, even though his win equity was also not particularly good against anybody but Nicole. But still pretty much steamrolls a lot of that season without much difficulty. So while he is eventually sniped out of the game by Will at 4, I don't particularly fault him that much for it. To where a lot of people like to bring this up as like, oh, Will manipulated his way to convince Hardy to take him to 4, where it's like, I feel like that was in Hardy's best interest anyway. As like everyone else was going to target him anyway. As again, like the decision between Will and Bunky is one where I do think Bunky was the right choice to boot at that point, with Bunky starting to win comps while Will still never won any comps. Like I just think he was probably in just a losing position either way, but still, like I do think Hardy definitely is a solid player. I think he has struggled with like fully owning his game. I think he would have struggled with a jury vote, but still, if he had one out, he would have probably won the game with him planning on taking Nicole. So again, for me, it's enough to put him here at number 56. At number 55, we're moving on to a player that I think was way ahead of their time. I think this is a player that had an understanding of the game that I think very few people did at the time he played. Though again, I still definitely have some issues with his game, but still, at number 55, I do have Roddy from BB3. And Roddy, again, is an interesting player to me in the sense that I do feel like he seemed to like fully have this grasp on how to play this game with the format that they had at the time of the players going home and being able to vote after having watched the show, to where again, like he played the game very intentionally. He played this very methodical game of one where he managed his perception so much through that season and cared so much about how he was coming off on the show while also still playing this very savvy strategic game, to where I think a lot of the flaws that come from his game are through his overt attempts at trying to manage that perception. But again, the way he was able to guilt trip people into doing what he wants is very impressive. Again, like the fact that Jason was going to target him for his HOH round and then Roddy just essentially guilt trips him into not putting him on the block is pretty insane there. Him almost guilt tripping Amy to essentially take herself out of the game in favor of keeping Roddy is also pretty insane there, to where again, like by the end of that week, Amy regrets not doing it. He also, again, was very well positioned early on in the game. He had the alliance with the men. Again, they flipped the vote on Tanya, to where again, he's a very aggressive player in that sense too, to where again, I do think Roddy is a very impressive player, one that like seemed to just really understand how the game should be played at that point. Another question is like, how would he adapt to the modern day, and if he would even be able to play a similar game in the modern day. But still, I think like at the time of BB3, his game is extremely impressive, which is why he's here for me at number 55. Now number 54, moving on to a few players that played multiple times and have definitely bigger pros about their runs, but still aren't the greatest players in the grand scheme of things. And at number 54, we're starting that off with James Hewling from BB 17 and 18, where again, James is a bit of a strange player in the fact that, again, he obviously had 2 appearances, both of them being somewhat deep runs. Again, his first time against 7th place, his second time 3rd place. Again, a solid record there. However, the reality is I don't think James is that great of a player within that, though I think he's also probably a better player than people give him credit for. I mean, people talk about him as this massive GOAT on BB18, and while, again, he probably does lose against both Paul and Nicole, he probably loses against most people in the end game, I still think James actually plays a solid BB18 game. Again, he is someone that is really just playing the middle for a lot of the season, where he's really involved in a lot of the power structures in the house. And while he like very rarely has like actual true control over what's going on, again, he is very safe for the majority of that game. But then he finally takes the game into his hands and flipping the game against Paulie. And once that goes through, again, he's in a pretty solid spot, to where again, like him taking out Victor the second time, I think was a pretty good move for him in particular. As obviously he still has his alliance with Natalie and Michelle, while also still having Corey and Nicole being more loyal to him than the other two. Again, he puts himself in a pretty solid spot in the game. The problem is that obviously Victor comes back, and then when Victor comes back, the other side has more numbers than them, where his side gets picked off one by one. But still, I do think had Victor not come back, I think James would have been in a pretty solid spot. Again, like being right in the middle of the house once again. But instead, again, he loses his allies. But even then, by the time Final 5, he's still someone that is being taken to the Final 3 with both pairs having to take shots at each other. Now, again, the question is win equity. I don't think he had much of any there. But again, I think his game overall is a little bit underrated. And I do think he was actively playing the middle for a lot of that season. And then, again, going to BB17, his first run, it's not that great. I mean, it's one where, again, he's still willing to make big moves. He still does win HOH and go after Shelly and Clay, which, I mean, again, probably should have gone after Vanessa, but still, Shelly and Clay, not a terrible target either. He is pretty well situated at the beginning of the game to where, while there were definitely people that could have potentially taken him out, he still was in a pretty solid core group of allies. And even after that, he still is able to build a bond with Austin and Liz and Julia, where that keeps him safe for a little bit later in the game. And again, like I think there are definitely things to praise with James. I do think he is a better social player than people give him credit for. I do think he plays the game a bit more than people give him credit for. Where again, for me, even though he's not the greatest player in the grand scheme of things, for me it's enough to put him here at number 54. Now number 53, moving on to another player with a very impressive track record, having a third and a fourth place finish, one of the highest averages in the history of the show, and that person is Christmas from BB19 and 22, who again, obviously people don't like Christmas. I get it. Also, again, is Christmas the most savvy player in the world? No. But again, like there is a reason why she makes it to the end of the game both times, and it's because she puts herself in these very strong alliances. Again, she is in a dominant alliance on 2 of her seasons, which is, again, like of the 2-time players we talked about so far, pretty unprecedented to have a player that was in a dominant alliance 2 times. Now, again, was she the most integral person within that alliance? No. And again, that is the issue why she's not higher on this list. As had that been the case, she would have been very, very high on this list. But again, in BB19, like she is able to build this like really good bond with Paul, where Paul does pick Josh and Christmas over all these other groups, despite the fact that Paul had deals with these other groups on them taking him to Final 2 anyway. Now again, she does pretty much give up at Final 3 and tells Josh to just take Paul, which is pretty bad. But again, had she gotten to the end against Paul, she probably wins. Like, had she somehow won that final HOH, she wins the game, kind of by accident, but she still wins. And also, I think something to factor is obviously the fact that she had an injured leg throughout all of it, which lessened her comp ability, which, again, who knows, she probably could have won that final HOH had she not been injured. And in 22, again, she once again finds herself in the majority alliance alongside the committee. Now, obviously, there is some bad play at points. Again, the treatment of Devon and Bailey is pretty bad. I do think she struggles to win a jury vote on that season, where I find it tough to see where the votes fully come from, though again, she definitely gets votes and is really the only person that actually puts Cody in any semblance of danger throughout the season, where again, had she won the Final 4 veto, Cody's out of the game, which could have bolstered her jury chances as well. Though again, I think there definitely are things to praise with Christmas's game, and the fact that she was in 2 dominant alliances on 2 appearances, had a 3rd and a 4th place finish. That's an impressive record, to where while there are other issues with her game, for me it's enough to put her here at number 53. Now number 52, we're moving on to a player, another one that people mostly don't like. However, I do think this person gets a bit shortchanged in terms of his ability as a player. And at 52, I do have Jeff Schroeder, Big Jeff. To where, again, like Jeff is someone that, again, don't agree with a lot of his opinions on things. However, I think as a player, again, like he has a pretty decent record. Again, a 5th place finish, a 7th place finish. I mean, while not as strong as the likes of James and Christmas, I think his actual play within those seasons is stronger. Where, again, a lot of people talk about how, like, oh, it's only because of the coup d'etat he gained any sort of power on BB11, which, again, I don't agree. Again, I do feel like had it not been for the coup d'etat, yeah, Jesse stays in the game for 1 round longer. But again, Jeff was already in this position where had Michelle won the next HOH, which happened, he was still going to be in a similar position in the game. Also, again, it was in a position where Jesse had already pretty much decided to work with Jeff and Jordan moving forward and not targeting them over the likes of Kevin and even Michelle, to where, again, like Jeff and Jordan had a pretty deep run in them even before the coup d'etat, which I think is pretty indicative of their pretty decent social play before that, to where, despite the fact that, again, it starts off very rocky, where Jeff sides with Brayden and is kind of on the outs for his first few rounds, I do think by the time of week 4, I think he does a lot to repair his game and building a bond with Russell, repairing his relationships with Jesse. And again, he's in a somewhat decent spot there, though obviously by the time we get towards the end of the game, he's in like a not great spot where I don't think he necessarily plays it poorly, where again, like he does take out Russell, which again, you could definitely qualm with. I don't think at the end of the day it really mattered, as Russell was someone that was going to take the shot at Jeff soon anyway, to where I think getting him out early, especially considering how competent of a comp competitor he had seemed to be up to that point, is not a terrible move. It's just obviously he couldn't win the Final 5 veto, where had he done that, he would have been in a pretty good spot Final Four. Again, him and Jordan versus Kevin and Natalie, where again, Hattie just won either the HOH or veto at Final Four. He's at Final 3 in a spot where he probably beats everybody at the end. Again, I think his BB11 game is one that is a bit underappreciated, and I think his BB13 game is a bit rougher. I mean, again, he's given a lot of advantages there by being with the vets from the very beginning. He also is, again, on a bit of a rocky path to where, while he does end up having a good chunk of allies around him, again, he has Jordan, he has Rachel eventually, he has Adam, he has Shelly. Obviously, Shelly eventually flips on him. And really, he was just always in this position where he was always this big target that was going to be taken out eventually. Though again, had he not been taken out at Final 7, it would have been pretty difficult to take him out beyond that. Again, if Adam stays loyal to him, and again, he still has Jordan by his side, to where, considering also his comp ability, again, like, he's probably in this pretty strong spot to just make it through a few more rounds. And again, if he gets to the end of that season, he probably wins also. To where I think he, again, despite some definite qualms with his personal beliefs, I think he does play a somewhat solid game on both his seasons. And because of that, for me, he is here number 52. Now, number 51, we're back to talking about another winner of the show. And here we do have a winner that we kind of just talked about, and that person is Jordan Lloyd from BB11. And Jordan's just a tough player for me to assess, and the fact that she is one of the most consistent players in the history of the show. Again, has a first place finish, has a fourth place finish. Even in her fourth place finish, she probably wins the game if she gets to the end of that season. That is pretty impressive. The problem is that I feel like she gets those positions by being just such a passive player, not even really being one actively. I think that's just simply her personality of just allowing Jeff to do a lot more of the legwork and her just kind of skating on by, which again is an effective strategy for her, at least in terms of getting far into the game. However, I do think in the modern day, I think this is a strategy that wouldn't really be effective to win the game, and I don't think Jordan could play any other way. To where, again, I think in the modern day, she would need to play a lot more strategically in the game and be more aware of her strategic game, which I don't feel like she really is. But again, she does win BB11 against, again, one of the biggest GOATs of all time in Natalie. For again, at least she was aware of the fact that Natalie was a big GOAT, where she doesn't take Kevin to the end, which again, Kevin was going to take her, which was dumb. She also was, again, pretty well positioned throughout a lot of that game, very rarely in danger, to where Jeff was always a target ahead of her. And again, as I said, like, Jesse was actually planning on taking them further into the game by the time the coup d'etat was used. Then we have her BB13 run, where again, benefited by having vets there, but outside that, again, also was relatively safe. And I think even in that season, like, I think she does some decent work in building social bonds. Again, she does make this alliance with Kalia that really benefits her in the game, that keeps her specifically safe from Kalia's HOHs. You do have her bonding with Rachel, her bonding with Shelly, her bonding with even the likes of Cassie. Also works well with Adam, where again, I do think she does some pretty good social work at points, even though a lot of it doesn't really come to roost. Again, like, she gets to an endgame position where she could have won the game. Now, to be fair, she loses there because of her own fault of her never really bonding with Portia. And also, again, would have been booted at 6 had it not been for Pandora's box anyway. But again, the fact that she was a former winner and comes back a second time to just be in an endgame position where she could have won again is pretty insane. So again, despite the fact that I don't think she's a very active player and I won't give her that much credit for how she maneuvers through the game, I do feel like, again, there is something there to just how passive she is, to where, considering her inherent likability as well, again, she had the chance of being a 2-time winner, and for me, again, that's enough to put her here at number 51. Now, number 50, we're keeping with another winner of the show. This one being another one that I very much questioned their overall game ability. However, I do feel like they are a player that probably plays a pretty repeatable game. And at the end of the day, I do look at them pretty similarly to Jordan. That person is Lisa from BB3. Again, like, for me, Lisa is a player that is, again, very good socially. She, again, is definitely competent physically, and strategically, I mean, she's fine. And I do think a lot of people give her probably too much strategic credit in her, like, getting Danielle and Jason to take her to the end, as if she was like this mastermind that tricked them into doing something against their best interests, when in reality, I think she was just a good social player that had them convinced simply because they liked her more. And again, I don't really think there's much of a, like, truly strategic bone in Lisa's body. I mean, she definitely gets, like, the baseline level strategy, though I don't really feel like she gets much beyond that. I mean, a lot of people talk about how, oh, she was taught by Daniel Reyes and was starting to play in a villainous way, but then, like, she doesn't, though. I mean, yeah, she doesn't vote for Eric to come back into the game, but really outside that, I mean, she pretty much plays the exact same game in the back half of the game as she does in the first half. Again, she's still not particularly cutthroat. She really just goes along with what the house is doing, and even in the Marcel's vote is completely out of the loop on that. She didn't even know Marcel's was going home. It's actually a vote for him to stay. I mean, she is someone that, again, I think her winning game is one that is probably a bit overestimated in the grand scheme of things, though I do think, again, she's a pretty repeatable player. I feel like if she were to play again, I think she could do the same thing again. The question is, would the jury respect her in the modern day? And to be honest, I don't think they do. I do feel like there's at least consistency in her run, where, again, like as a whole, I largely look at her as a Jordan. I think a better version than Jordan, in the sense that, again, I do think there is at least that slight edge to her, to where I feel like with Jordan, there's not a single strategic bone in her body. I feel like with Lisa, again, there is. It's just that it's still not that great, but still at least there, to where, again, for me, she's here, number 50. Now, 49, we're moving on to a player that I initially did have higher on this list, because I do think this is a player that definitely demonstrated a lot of potential in the game that was never realized, though at the same time, I think when actually assessing this list and putting this list together, it did feel weird to have her higher than this. At 49, I do have Hannah Chadha from BB23, and obviously Hannah is a player that, again, had a lot of potential. She definitely had a pretty competent strategic mind for the game. She did seem to be a major strategist for the likes of Tiffany and helping her navigate through the game. However, the problem is that I don't feel like we've ever truly gotten to see Hannah play the game as an individual, where obviously a lot of her game is based around the cookout and her being this main strategist for the cookout and helping them create their plans, but I feel like we never really got to see Hannah play for her own game. So I feel like very little of how she maneuvers through the game is obviously based around her own personal game, which I think on paper you would say is a criticism of the cookout as a whole. However, I still think with the likes of, again, Tiffany and Xavier, Kylan, we see them making moves for their own best interest at points, where I feel like with Hannah, I don't feel like we really see that as much, where it feels like most times that a move like that can be made, she essentially just folds. And beyond that, again, I do feel like, again, most of her game is simply just potential. Again, we never really got to see it because of how the cookout was structured, or she was not in a particularly good spot within it. Though, again, I don't really fault her for going along with it, considering obviously the outside of the game influences that there are there. But it does make me a bit unsure of where exactly to land her as a player, to where I think there definitely is a lot of potential there. I mean, I would say if she were to return, I would have a lot of faith in her ability, whether, again, being well liked socially, her having a pretty competent strategic mind, again, her not being a complete slouch in challenges either, to where, again, I think she could be a pretty solid player. But again, I do feel like a lot of that is simply just potential that we never got to see realized, which makes it tough to put her much higher on the list here, number 49. Now, number 48, we're moving on to one of the better one-time non-winning players, which, to be fair, we'll be running through a good chunk of them moving forward, even though, again, it ends up being pretty different to my list I made years ago. But either way, at number 48, we're starting that off with Shelly Moore from BB13, who, again, I think is a pretty solid player through and through. Again, she's a player that was able to play the middle pretty well, again, being associated with the Vet Alliance, being a very solid number for them in the very beginning, but also still having connections to the Danielle and Kalia side of things. Again, she's a very important number during the Luan boot week and convincing Kalia to put Luan on the block. She obviously works alongside Jeff and Jordan until she finally decides it's the time to strike, which, to be fair, I think she probably strikes a bit too early in a spot where that really just leaves her open the following week. But even then, again, she wasn't actually going home in week 6 until the Pandora's box happened, which screwed her over. But even beyond that, I mean, really, I don't think she was really poised for the long term after she had made the Jeff move. I mean, I think she was probably poised to be taken out around the time of Final Four based on how the game was laid out. Where, again, she didn't really have much of a relationship with Portia, and considering how the comps played out, I think more than likely, even without Pandora's box, she probably just gets taken out at 4 by Portia. But still, I mean, I think she's definitely a very competent player, one that, again, navigated through the game in a very impressive way of manipulating people, to where, again, I think Shelly is a very solid player. The reason she's not higher on this list, though, is really win equity. I do feel like she really struggles at winning at the end, especially after she flips against Jeff, to where I think in most situations, again, she's never getting Jeff and Jordan. I think she probably struggles to get Brennan and Rachel. And again, against any of Danielle, Kalia, and Portia, they're voting for each other. To where, again, I just find it tough to see Shelly actually squeezing out a win unless she's at the end against Adam, but even then Adam gets votes. So I think it's a bit of a tough road to a win, but I think the way she navigated through the game is very impressive, which is why she's here, number 48. Now, 47, we're moving on to a player that I think is essentially Shelly, but with a bit more win equity, though probably with a bigger knock in the middle of the game, which makes him only a spot higher than Shelly, and that person is Cliff from BB21. And again, I think Cliff is a very impressive player. I mean, and people were obviously very frustrated with him, especially by the end of BB21, though I think he played his game very impressively. Though obviously, again, there's the major knock of the fact that he was voted out and then had to come back to the game in week 3, though I think that was a very fluky situation where essentially Nicole's backdoored and they decided to save Nicole as simply just as a screw you to Nick, where Cliff really just ends up going there by accident. But again, like still, he does get voted out, comes back in the game. That's definitely something to criticize. But from that point forward, again, I think he plays a pretty optimal game. Again, I think he makes decisions that I mostly agree with. So where, again, while they can be frustrating to see, like him backing down on targeting Jack due to Diamond Power Veto, and him obviously building a bond with Jackson and Holly that he remains loyal to for most of his game. And those are obviously frustrating aspects of his game. Along the fact that, again, he cuts Tommy instead of Holly at the final 5 can all be frustrating. But again, those were decisions that I personally agreed with at the time. And while I think at the end of the day, you do have to criticize him for not taking the shot at Jackson when he could have during the double eviction, it still was a position where does he really go after that? And again, for him to make that big decision during a double eviction, I think is a tough thing to actually expect him to do. Where I think Cliff plays, again, a very optimal game until pretty much the final 6. And I think from that point on, you could definitely argue with some of his decisions. Where I think it's dumb the fact that he makes a deal for Nicole to win the final 4 HOH. That puts him in more danger. And again, he just puts a bit too much faith into Jackson. Though again, he also essentially gets screwed over by a comp run, though, also. Where again, that's something to factor in as well. Though, where again, like for me, I do think Cliff is probably a pretty solid player in the grand scheme of things. For me, he's here number 47. Now number 46. Again, a similar player, one that, again, pretty underestimated in Big Brother history, though I think is commonly cited as one of the most underrated players in Big Brother history. I think some of those people probably rate her a bit too high, but I think she's a very good player, and that person is Karen from BB5. And Karen is a very interesting player to me in the sense that she seemed to have a full awareness of what the game was from a very early point in the show. Again, at the time, BB5, she seemed to be the person that was able to articulate the social game of Big Brother the best on the show, along with the concepts of jury management, to which, again, like I think Karen definitely demonstrated a lot of knowledge about the game at that point, and again played a very solid game to where, while again there were definitely points where she wasn't in the majority, she still was able to build really strong bonds with Lori and Will, and that ends up leading to the creation of the Pinky Swear Alliance, where she had good bonds with Nokomis within that. She's one of the people leading the charge against Jason Scott, and then later the twins, and again gets to the end game in a position where, again, she has a lot of win equity. It does seem like the jury did really respect her, where the twins really liked her, Will obviously really liked her, Nokomis was going to vote for her. Again, she seemed to have a good chunk of the jury like fully on board with her, though I think an issue for Karen, and something that would affect her in the modern day, is the fact that I do feel like a lot of her respect in the game came from people liking her more so than game respect, where I think very few people in the game actually respected the game she played, even though, again, it was a very impressive game. Of her being able to socially blend into the house and actively do things to try to gain their jury votes, like spending time with them when they're emotional or walking them on their way out. And again, like Karen is a very intentional player, and I think that is pretty impressive, though I do think it's, again, a gameplay style that I don't think really fits in the modern day, which, to be fair, obviously, again, if she were to play again, she probably would adapt to that. But I think that's definitely something to call out here, is that her initial game is one that, again, I don't think is very adaptable to the modern game, along with the fact that I think there's also criticisms we had strategically, and the fact that, again, how does she not target Drew in the end game? Like, to me, that's still pretty ridiculous for her to never even actually go through targeting Drew, where, again, she does definitely recognize what Drew is doing in the game, but she simply does almost nothing about it, which is something to critique as well. But again, as a whole, I still think a very strong player, one that, again, had a lot of win equity and gets kind of taken out due to wonky circumstances of them allowing people to work together and the veto, to where, again, like for me, there's enough good there to where she's here number 46. Now number 45, we're moving on to a player that I think is also a bit of an understated player in Big Brother history, one that doesn't commonly get talked about, but probably plays the second best game of Big Brother 6, and that person is April Lewis, who, again, like I feel like people just don't talk about the fact that April Lewis was actually a pretty competent Big Brother player. I mean, she was someone that was like a bit more in the middle of the house of the friendship, to where, while obviously, yeah, she did complain a lot about Janelle and didn't like Janelle, she still was actually the person that friendship liked the most out of their group, to where, again, I think April was definitely a more palatable person to them than the likes of Maggie and Yvette. And beyond that, again, like she obviously gets to a final 4 where, had Yvette or Maggie not won the veto there, she is safe in that round, in a position where she makes the final 3 with, say, Yvette getting voted out 4, she's essentially guaranteed to win, where she beats both Maggie Cassie and Janelle, with both of them taking her, where again, she was just so close to essentially a guaranteed win in the game, which is definitely something to prop her up for as well. Where again, I think April actually plays a solid game, one that again still has her working with the friendship, but being the most palatable person of the friendship, or when the friendship comes into the jury phase with numbers, again, she's essentially guaranteed to win if she's able to make it to the end, and again, just has a very unlucky circumstances that kind of ruins that at the end for her. But I still think as a whole, April Lewis is a pretty underrated player, and because of that, for me, she's here number 40. Now 44, moving on to a player that, again, people don't like. This is someone that obviously people are annoyed by in real life, though I do feel like on the game, he actually played a pretty solid game, and that person is JC from BB20. Now, I think the big criticism of JC's game is the fact that he was obviously working for the level 6 alliance, an alliance that he was kind of on the bottom on. And while that is true, obviously, like, he kind of overcomes that, or he ends up outlasting most of the members of level 6, ends up being in the final 3 with Tyler and Casey, where again, that's a bad spot to be in, as Tyler and Casey are going to take each other. They're more likely to win parts 1 and 2 of the final HOH. However, again, had JC won final HOH, he also essentially wins the game. Where, I mean, based on what the jury has said, I mean, he beats both Tyler and Casey. He also beats Angela and probably beats Sam, probably beats Brett. I mean, like, I would say he's probably one of the biggest jury threats on that entire season. It was also looked at as a pretty big strategic player. I mean, like, he does do some pretty impressive things. I mean, like, early on, again, he's very integral in keeping Falte in the dark and making them second guess what's actually going on. I mean, obviously during the Fessy HOH where he targets Scotty, I think he deserves a lot of credit in getting Fessy to believe that it was Scotty that betrayed him. So again, I think there is a lot good there with JC. I think the problem comes from, again, him just kind of working for Alliance that he's on the bottom of. But outside of that, again, I think his game is pretty solid, and I do think he is a mostly competent player. If he had at least just picked a better number 1 ally than Tyler, who just had so many other options. But yeah, for me, I think he's a solid player. He's here number 44. Now number 43, we have someone that I'm kind of surprised is this high on this list. I did not expect this person to be this high when I initially concepted this list, though again, like, looking at the people that are around him on this list, I do feel like it makes sense. And that person is Shane from BB14. And again, Shane's a bit of a strange pick here. I mean, he is a player that obviously was very dominant in challenges, one of the best challenge competitors we've probably ever seen. Again, won the first 3 vetoes in a row along with week 3 HOH, and then proceeded to win other competitions along the way. He was, again, in the majority alliance for a good chunk of the game, and while he was in a precarious spot right away, and I do fault a lot of that to Billy Hance more so than Shane. And even then, he's able to recover from that, where he's able to build the bond with Dan and Danielle, along with Brittany, to where they end up running a really good chunk of the game. And even after Brittany gets taken out, following Dan's funeral, he's really able to continue from that in a still solid spot. Now, obviously, Dan does turn against him by the time of the final 6, where it almost backdoored him had it not been for the fact that Danielle fought against the plan. And then at final 5, again, he was the main target, only for him to eventually be taken out at final 4. But again, like, I do think his game is, again, a solid one. I think if he somehow got to the end, which again isn't unfeasible to think that he could win just 2 competitions in the end game, again, he probably wins the game. Yeah, I think against really anybody in that final 4, I think he probably wins. Probably beats the likes of Joe and Jen as well. Like, I really feel like he beats a lot of people on this season in the end. For mixing that, the fact that, again, he was in a pretty solid alliance for most of the game, again, was very solid competitions, and he is a pretty competent player there. Now, again, like, I don't really have much faith in his strategic ability, but still, I think overall, a pretty solid player. Well, again, came very close to winning, while also just feeling like an all-arounder, which for me is enough to put him here at number 43. Now number 42, moving on to a very similar player, one that I think we probably saw a bit more strategy to where he's higher than Shane, though I think probably has a bit more faults in his game beyond that. But again, as a whole, a spot above him, and that person is Corey Brooks from BB18. And Corey is someone that I think plays a pretty strong game on that season. It's one where, again, he comes extremely close to winning as well. Again, had he gotten to the end against anybody in the final 4, I think he probably wins, even against Nicole. And again, it was in a position where, like, Nicole was trying to get to the end with him, which is pretty misguided. He also, again, just feels like a pretty solid all-around player. And he's decent enough physically. Again, not one of the biggest challenge competitors we've ever seen, but again, still definitely was competent in challenges. He was, again, seemingly good socially. Again, right away, he's in the majority alliance and has these, like, really strong connections to the likes of, like, Nicole and Pauly. And again, I think strategically, again, I would say he's actually pretty decent. I mean, again, he seemed to have actually more of a rational mind at points in the end game than Nicole, of him realizing what they needed to do as a duo to navigate through the game, while Nicole, again, sometimes didn't know if they could pull the trigger on those things. And again, I feel like Corey is actually a pretty competent all-around player. Now, again, I think the reason why he's around where Shane is, even though I think he's probably better than Shane in most aspects of the game, is I think his actual BB-18 game is probably one where there's probably a little bit more holes. I still find the second Victor eviction to be a spot where Corey gets extremely lucky in that position, where, again, had it not been a position where there was a double HOH, I think he more than likely goes home at that point. Sure, again, to be fair, who knows if he just wins the buyback anyway, though I don't feel like that's particularly likely. Along with that, I do feel like he's a lot more at fault for his elimination, where with Shane, again, it was a spot where, I mean, yeah, you could definitely qualm the fact that he didn't fight more against Danielle of putting him on the block, but really, I feel like it makes a lot of sense for Dan's game to obviously cut Shane in that position, where, again, Corey gets cut by James, where it makes no sense for James to cut him. So for me, that's also a little knock there. But again, as a whole, I do think Corey's a pretty solid all-around player. Again, has some holes here and there in his overall game, but for me, again, it's enough for him to be here at number 42. Now, number 41, we're moving on to a player that I do look at in a similar level as Corey, and the fact that he, again, seemed to be a pretty competent all-around player, again, pretty good physically, had some strategic chops while being okay socially, and that person is Austin from BB17. And Austin, I think, is just a pretty solid all-around player, one that, again, ends up playing a pretty impressive game. While there's definitely holes to be had in his game, I mean, early on, he's kind of on the outs, and while he is able to gain some power through building a bond with Vanessa, that later translates to him getting a relationship with Shelly and Clay that allows them to kind of run the early merge portion of the game, early pre-merge portion of the game. He still kind of ends up messing that up by the time week 5, where, and obviously he ends up falling in love with Liz, to where he ends up leaking the twin twist to others and ends up trying to put like a bullseye on Julia's back to try to keep Liz safe, and all that is just kind of dumb, and it does really turn his own allies against him, to where he gets very fortunate in the fact that Vanessa ends up being the one to win the HOH. For through all of his begging, he's able to win her back, but still, that was a very precarious spot to be in. And beyond that, and again, he does run the game for a lot of it, to where even at points where he's not in power, he is relatively safe, to where, again, Shelly and Clay are targets ahead of him, even Vanessa is a target ahead of him. The problem comes from the fact that, again, he ends up taking out all of his opposition, to where when left within his own alliance, again, we do have Vanessa, Steve, and Johnny Mac really taking the game from under him and flipping on him at the final 5, to where he gets kind of sniped out of the game there. Probably being the last chance they would have had in getting him out, as beyond that, him and Liz would have been together at the final 4. And again, had Austin gotten to the end of the game, I do think he very likely wins, especially against anybody but Vanessa. So again, I do think there is a lot to like with Austin's game. I do think he plays a pretty stable middle portion of the game and is kind of running the game for a good chunk of that portion of the game. Though again, in comparison to the people higher on the list, I do feel like his game is definitely a lot more rocky than most of these people, to where, again, for me, Austin lands here number 41. Now, number 40, we're moving on to a player that I had actually much higher on this list when I first started this. He was actually, I believe, in the top 25 in my first draft of this list. However, in the time since, I just find it tough to actually think of him as a top 25 player Big Brother, and that person is Kylan from B23. And again, I do think Kylan is a good player of Big Brother. I think he definitely demonstrated a lot of potential on his season, where again, he was a very strong competitor in competitions. He was a pretty competent player strategically until he wasn't, which we'll talk about. While socially, again, he was good with certain people. He was also not very good with other people, but again, like, still a good enough player all around there. And I do think he was probably the player that was playing the most independently from the cookout, at least initially, to where I don't think he gets fully on board with the plan until towards the end of the pre-jury phase of the game. And I do think if it had not been for Cookout, again, Kylan could have been in a very good spot. Now, I do think Kylan is not in as locked in of a good spot as the likes of a Tiffany, a Claire, a DX, to where, I do think he would have definitely worked with them, but I do think he would have been on the outskirts of that group. I think he probably would have been number 6 or 7 in their power structure, to where, considering the fact that he was a massive threat in the game that won a whole bunch of comps, I would not be shocked if they tried to take an earlier shot at him, to where who really knows where he lands in the game without the Cookout. But with the Cookout, again, he gets to the final 6 in a position where he's essentially the swing. I mean, at the time they're at 6, again, it is essentially Tiffany and Hannah versus Xavier and Big D, and he is essentially the person in the middle. However, he decides to side with Xavier, despite not really having that much of a relationship with Xavier by that point in the game. However, he is continuously told that Xavier is the best player in the game and that Xavier is going to win at the end. And with Kylan, his entire thing is that he wants to beat the best, because he wants to be like Goku. And again, that was just ridiculous. His overall in-game strategy, which again makes it tough for me to land him higher. Really, if it was not for that, I actually probably would have kept him in the top 25. But again, just the sheer ridiculousness of him saving Xavier over and over again, despite Xavier being the biggest threat to him in the game. And obviously the person that eventually caught him was just insane, to where, again, while I do think most of his game is pretty strong, I feel like that's something that I can't really excuse, which makes me not put him much higher in the list. But I do think he is overall a really good player, but he is landing here at number 40. At number 39, we're moving on to kind of a series here of two-time players that at least had one really strong run in them. We're starting this off with a pretty iconic player here, but one that I do think is a bit of a messy player, and that person is Allison from obviously BB4 and BB7. And Allison, again, I think plays a very impressive game on BB4. Now, again, I definitely have qualms with it, particularly the fact that, again, I do struggle with realizing just how intentional certain aspects of her game are, along with the fact that, again, we just see her kind of going in and out of the majority at points, where, again, we see her being part of the Elite Eights, only to then be targeted by Dana in week 3, only for her to then be HOH, and get rid of Dana, only for her to then kind of float through the game. Though still had some spots where she could have potentially been in danger, though by the end of the game, again, she's essentially just looked as a massive goat, where most people wanted to take her to the end by that point. But again, it was simply just due to the fact that she couldn't win. And again, that is the issue for me with Allison, is the fact that I don't think Allison can win the game. I think Allison struggles to win a jury vote against really anybody on this season. I mean, unless she somehow miraculously got to the end against Dana, I don't really think she beats anybody in the post-jury phase of this game. And again, while it is still very impressive the way she floats through the game, again, essentially being the first to actively float in the game, where, again, June had been kind of doing it beforehand. But yeah, I think Allison was really the first to really hone in on this floating strategy of really playing off of both sides and propping up your position in the middle. Though, to be fair, I mean, she does eventually get beat her own game by June, which we'll talk about. But I think Allison is definitely a very solid player, one that plays a very solid game on BB4, to where, again, I don't really even factor in her BB7 game that much. Again, it's not really much of a game. It's one where she didn't come in a good spot. But even then, despite that, again, doesn't play particularly well. She does the openly target Janelle, but still, I do think it's not really a game that really changes my overall opinion of her game, where I do look at her as a pretty solid player all around. That's why she's here number 39. Now, number 38, we're moving on to a player. I've been kind of all over the board with this person. I've at points thought this player was pretty solid. I've at points thought this person wasn't that good. And I will say I did recently rewatch this person's season. I do think through that rewatch, it did elevate my opinion on this person again, and that person is Diane Henry from BB5 and BB7, to where, again, like, Diane's BB5 game, I think, is one that is actually pretty impressive for the time. I think she's a very dynamic player for the time of Big Brother 5, to where, you know, while she is in the Pinky Swear Alliance, she also is part of the Twin Alliance and does play off of both sides pretty well at the mid portion of the game, to where, again, coming into the final 9 round, I would say she's the best position in the game by quite a bit. However, I do think there are some faults. Diane's game, particularly her seemingly emotional play of cutting the twins, something that I do think is against her best interest. It burns her to jury votes of the twins, while also, again, just putting her in this position where she's tied to Nokomis and Karen, who are much closer to each other than they are with her. Now, obviously, she still has Drew as a backup, and it does feel like at that point she does go all in on her relationship with Drew. But again, like, it's Drew, the person who ends up cutting her, along with the fact that, again, I think Drew is someone that probably beats her at the end as well. So there's definitely faults to have there. The fact that she goes so far out of her way to try to get to the end of Drew, who probably ends up beating her. But again, I do think Diane's game is one that is pretty fluid for this point in Big Brother. And again, another one that I don't really factor in BB7 that much, as, again, she came into that season with pretty big target on her back, probably with Janelle really wanting to go after her, though at the same time, again, she almost orchestrates a flip against Will. I mean, that's something to say at least. Or really, most of my opinions of her game do come down to her BB5 game. But again, BB7 isn't entirely bad, even though, again, it's not great. But still, I do think Diane is definitely a very competent player, to where that's why she's here at number 38. Now, at 37, we're moving on to a player that definitely has a better track record overall than the last two people we talked about, though I do question his overall game ability a bit more after his second appearance than the other two, and that person is Kevin Campbell from BB11 and BB22. And Kevin's BB11 game, I think, is one that is pretty good. Now, I think you can argue, is it better than the likes of Allison's game or Diane's game from their first seasons? To which I would probably say no. Now, again, I think it is a good game where he does play the middle for a lot of the season. He isn't fully attached to the Jesse Alliance, but is still relatively safe from this loose connection that he has. I think a major issue for me is the fact that I do think he was a pretty big target by the time the coup d'etat, where had the coup d'etat not been played, again, he definitely was someone being talked about as a target. And to be fair, he makes the most of that opportunity by voting out Jesse and picking up Natalie as an ally, but I think there definitely is questionable play there. So again, I think his endgame is mostly strong, and he does do very good work in turning Jeff against Russell, to where Jeff eventually makes the move against Russell at Final 6, only for him to then backstab Jeff the following week, which is all really good. But again, I do also not love his Final 3 decision, where it was actually a spot where had he won Final HOH, he was actually going to take Jordan to the end, in a spot where, again, he probably beats her, but it is very close, where it is a 4-3 vote either way. And like, really, it's coming down to Natalie, who he would have just voted on in that situation, where again, like, who knows? So again, not a great spot. And even beyond that, I do think his BB22 game is also, again, very questionable. While he does have a lot of longevity on that season, I feel like he does very little, like, actively right outside of just, again, survival in the game. So he's really just on the bottom of that season the entire time with no real chance of doing much. And to be fair, again, the committee's blowout of the challenges definitely played a factor into that. But I do feel like Kevin didn't really get to do much on that season to really propel his legacy. So, as a whole, I did struggle with where to put him, because again, I do think the likes of Diane and Allison have better first games than Kevin, but I do think Kevin's longevity on his second appearance is something to at least credit him for. So again, for me, I did decide to just put him against slightly higher than the other two at number 37 here. Number 36, we're moving on to a player, again, kind of in a similar tier, but I think a player that probably is a bit underestimated in Big Brother history, and that player is Brittany Haynes from BB's 12 and 14, who obviously is well renowned as a character on the show, though I don't think is very well remembered as a player. And to be fair, I think her BB12 game is a bit rocky. It's one where obviously she's being tricked by the Brigade the entire season, only to be the last one cut by them at the very end. But even then, I think there's some really good social work she does across the season. She builds these really strong bonds with like Reagan and Matt, and even in the end game, she has Lane going out of his way to try to take Brittany to the end. Again, that is impressive, especially considering the fact that I think she possibly beats Lane at the end. I think it's an extremely close vote, but again, I think it's something that's against Lane's best interest. But I think most of the credit I would give her is for her BB14 game, where, again, I think it's very impressive, the power structure she was able to form there, to where, while initially on the outside losing Willie and JoJo, she is able to build this really good relationship with Danielle and Dan, to where they form a 4-person alliance that really ends up just running the game, until she obviously gets sniped out due to Dan's funeral. But really before that, again, she was in a very solid position. Again, it would have been very difficult to take her out of the game, with her building a really strong bond with Ian, to where that could potentially save her. And also, to a degree, again, Brittany gets screwed over by the fact that Ian had a second veto that week, where had that not been the case, Ian probably goes home instead. Now, obviously, we can also add in reindeer games, which, I mean, for Brittany, I didn't feel like really changed that much. I think it just really confirmed that, she is a very good social player. She was very well positioned early on. I will say, I do feel like she got a little bit sloppy. Like, her targeting of Danielle just seemed to be really misguided from her point of view, to where, like, really for me, I feel like reindeer games just kind of kept her around the same, where initially I was thinking she might go up just due to the fact that she seemed to be doing pretty well socially at the beginning, but considering her, again, kind of misstep there, I do feel like it kind of just equals out to where I was going to put her to begin with. And I think there's a lot to praise for her BB14 game. While her BB12 game is, again, largely mediocre, I think there's still some really good social work within it, to where, again, I think she is a very good player. One I don't think we ever got to see the true potential of her game play out, but again, for mostly what she did on BB14, she's enough to be here at number 36. Now number 35. We're moving back to another winner of the show. It's been a bit. This being a winner I am largely conflicted on. I do feel like this is a winner that I don't really know where I really stand on them as a player, because I think there's some massive highs, there's some massive lows, and that player is Adam Jasinski from BB9. And Adam, I just think, is a tough player here. Again, he's one where early on he plays terribly. I mean, he makes a massive target of himself. He almost goes home, and Jacob does. He's only saved by the fact that Jacob somehow does worse. But again, he makes a massive target of him and Sheila, which is not great. He does end up playing pretty emotionally at points. I mean, he does vote James back into the game, even though that was probably something not in his best interest, just due to the fact that he obviously liked James. He also doesn't nominate James during his eviction week, which is pretty dumb as well, as it just gave James the opportunity to save Sharon and really screw him over. But I do feel like from Final 5 on, I think he plays mostly optimally, and spends a lot of that time really just undermining Ryan along the way, which is pretty interesting. Though at the same time, I do question how much of that is fully intentional in the Final 4 round, at least. And where it did seem like for most of that round, he was actually going to keep Sharon around, something that was obviously beneficial to Ryan, with Ryan having a better relationship with Sharon. Aaron. However, he changes his mind at the last second, which again should have been the obvious decision, and him seeming to do so not because he has a closer connection to Sheila, but more so because Sheila would not win the final HOH. So I think that's like not great, but it is still technically the optimal move for him. And again, his final 5 round, I think he does pretty good work in maintaining Natalie's jury vote, and him throwing the final HOH to Ryan allows him to get through that round while getting more blood on his hands. And again, I think he does a very good job of just undermining Ryan throughout a lot of that end game, which is something I've always propped him up for. But really, I do feel like a lot of his game is a bit rocky. I do think his game is one where, again, like early on, he's not particularly liked. Middle of the game, he is making some pretty misguided strategic decisions. And while, again, his end game is very strong, it's still one where, again, I do come out of this being very conflicted why I truly think of him as a player. But again, for now, I decided to land him here at number 35. Number 34, moving on to actually another winner of the show, one that I think is actually not that dissimilar from Adam, even though this comparison doesn't really get brought up much. But I do think a similar player to Adam ends up being Josh Martinez from BB19. And to be fair, I think a lot of people would probably say Josh Martinez is too high here on this list, being at number 34 of the best players of all time. And again, I can definitely get that. However, I do think Josh is someone that I do think is a bit understated in Big Brother history. Now, again, is his early game bad? Yeah, again, he was almost taken out week 1. Had he not gotten that safety, he probably goes week 1. He, beyond that, again, is not really taking that seriously and is kind of being dragged as a number for Paul for a lot of it. Though, again, I think there is a reason why Paul picks Josh and Christmas over the other pairings. And you could definitely argue that, okay, it's just because they thought that Josh and Christmas were the biggest goats. But I do think there also was this actual genuine personal relationship that they had made. And really, for me, that's the thing with Josh. That I do think Josh is actually pretty good socially when he's not being extremely emotional, where obviously there are points where he's extremely emotional, lashes out at people for no real reason. But again, when he is playing with his more rational mind, I do feel like he actually does play somewhat well. Again, having decent relationships with people. And to a fair part of this is probably coming from the challenge and seeing him be a fixture on the challenge, with him having so many social connections there. But I do feel like Josh in the modern day, if he were to play again, I would have a lot of faith in Josh to be in this majority alliance for a lot of the game. And considering like his undermining of Paul in the end game, again, I would not be shocked at Josh actually having this killer instinct on a return, and again, being a pretty competent player to where even in his BB19 game, again, he figures out the fact that Paul isn't as big of a jury threat as he assumed and proceeds to just continuously undermine Paul in his goodbye messages, which is, again, a very innovative move for the time, and one that really ends up kind of winning him the game by really turning Alex and Jason against Paul, to where through their pact with Mark, Elena, and Cody, it really just allows Josh to end up winning the game in a position where he probably also beats Christmas if he somehow got to the end with her. And obviously we can add reindeer games to this, which, to be fair, didn't really change my opinion that much of him. I do feel like most of what we saw in reindeer games was what I saw in the challenge, which just kind of reconfirmed that I do think Josh can be a pretty rational player in the game and someone that can do well if he were to play the game with his current life experience. But really for me, Josh is a player that, again, at the end of the day, I think he's pretty similar to Adam. Again, a player that made some misguided strategic decisions at points, again, was pretty emotional in the game, was saved in week 1 due to something completely out of their control. And now I think there's a difference both ways in the fact that I think Adam's end game is a lot more impressive, at least on paper, though again, I think Josh is someone that I would have more faith in on a return. In fact, again, I do like him being the innovator of this new way to utilize the goodbye messages. That for me is, again, good enough to put Josh here at number 34. Now, number 33, we're moving on to a series of runners up here. Some of the better ones, with this first one being one that was so close to winning the game. They literally made a game-losing decision at the very end, though really the rest of their game is just kind of a mostly stable game with maybe one major exception. But still, I think this person is a mostly solid player, and that person is Monty from BB24. And Monty, again, I do think is a mostly stable player in the fact that he is, again, a consistent player through and through. Again, I think he's pretty solid socially. He's obviously good at competitions, and also he is, again, competent strategically. He is someone that, again, was part of the initial power structure, was one of the leaders of that alliance early on, and then proceeds to flip on that alliance through the creation of the leftovers. And like, to be fair with the leftovers, I think he's not in as good of a spot as he could have been in that group, to where I do feel like he kind of drops the ball a little bit in like having Kyle really take the forefront, while also having even like a Joseph playing the game more aggressively than him, as he was constantly being talked about as someone that the likes of a Michael would eventually go after. But again, it never goes through. Or obviously we get the split house twist, and then following that, we get this position where Monty does flip on the like of Michael, Brittany, and Taylor, only to then end the week somehow in a position where he was actually going to go home, which, to be fair, I mean, it was largely due to the fact that Michael had won the veto. But again, like, Kyle had actually convinced everyone to put Monty on the block, and Monty was going to go out, had it not been for the fact that Kyle obviously had his spot blown up that week, which again feels like Monty getting saved due to something completely out of his control. However, from that point on, again, he really does dominate the game, again, winning comp after comp after comp, being completely safe in that entire end game stretch, while also, again, like, leading the action as you typically would in the end game if you're winning competitions. But again, he gets to a spot where he almost wins the game. Again, had he taken Turner at the final three, he wins the game in a near unanimous vote, but then just doesn't and takes Taylor instead, which is obviously a massive flaw in his game, his lack of awareness that the fact that Taylor would win a jury vote. The two fair, I mean, really most people in the house had that opinion of thinking that Turner was a massive jury threat when he really wasn't. But still, I mean, I do think there is a lack of awareness there, that mixing down the fact that, again, he was also almost booed the final 8. Again, like, it's enough to not put him higher on the list, but I do think as a whole he seems like a very competent all-around player, which is why he's here number 33. Number 32, moving on to a runner-up that I was a bit conflicted on where to land this person. Again, this one was all over the place. There was a point where this person kind of barely even made the top 100, and then eventually they made top 50, and I guess now they're number 32. And that person is Lane from BB12, who was obviously a part of the brigade, obviously a very important figure due to that. Well, even beyond that, again, like, he got the final 2 in a situation where he does get the votes of Brennan and Rachel, votes that they later regret, along with the vote of Brittany, which, again, like, his connection with Brittany is definitely one of the bigger pros of the game, especially the fact that he was able to keep Brittany in as long as he was, to where, again, the entire strategy of the brigade was to create these parachute alliances. However, Lane actually got his parachute alliance to the final 4, which is actually pretty insane. It was, again, something that, like, Xavier was trying to do with Alyssa, but was unable to. Now, again, I do qualm with the fact that, again, I think there's definitely a chance that Brittany beats him in a jury vote. Again, I think it's extremely close, but still, I mean, like, the fact that he was self-interested outside of just the brigade and making these moves to give him the better odds in the end game, I think is something to definitely give him credit for. Now, beyond that, I do think he's someone that, again, wasn't really an active driver in the game for most of it. Again, for a lot of the early game while he was in the brigade, I feel like he was probably the least integral to the brigade's success. Now, again, he definitely does play a factor into Matt Blindside and him convincing Brittany to go through the move. But really, I mean, I think that's a move that was really just shared credit amongst all the brigade members. And outside that, again, I think he's simply just kind of there. So I do think it makes it tough to assess his game. I mean, like, even despite that, again, I do think he still beats Enzo. So at least he had, like, a winning scenario. But even then, again, he wasn't taking Enzo to the end. And Enzo, if he had one final HOH, wasn't taking him either. So, again, that is obviously an issue. Again, I think Lane, once again, is a pretty competent all-around player. Again, could do well in comps. He was pretty good socially, and strategically, again, he was self-interested. So again, for me, he does have a lot of the box you would want to have checked off, where I think the major issue is the fact of his intentionality and him fully intending on going against people that would end up beating him in the game, which is not a particularly good look. But outside that, I do think he is a pretty solid player here. One that, while at this point, I think he's probably one of the lesser players of the brigade, that's still a pretty impressive spot to be in. But really, I just look at him as a pretty competent all-around player, one that made it all the way to final 2 in a very dominant alliance, because that for me is here at number 32. Now, number 31, we're moving on to another runner-up in the game, the one that does have 2 appearances on the show, both pretty strong appearances, even though you could definitely qualm with his overall game ability. But that person is Memphis from BB's 10 and 22, to where, again, Memphis, I think, plays an okay game on BB 10. Again, he is the runner-up of that season, though really I feel like a lot of his game on that season is in the first half, again, not particularly great. I mean, it's, again, he's still someone that is involved in getting Brian on the block, but outside that, he's just kind of there, making a pretty big target of himself, to where he is the target coming into week 4, that was obviously saved there. And again, that is due to some good connections he makes with the likes of Keisha and Dan, to where obviously they end up running the game following that, partly due to a lot of competition wins. But really, I do feel like a lot of his end game is him, again, working alongside alongside Dan, but Dan just doing everything he can to undercut Memphis along the way, with Memphis ending up getting no votes at the end, simply just due to how much Dan kind of outplayed him in that instance. Obviously, when he returned to 22, again, I think he ends up playing a pretty solid game after the first couple rounds, where again, at that point, it's a bit rocky and just very openly trying to play the middle between the new school and old school players. And then, but again, once the committee ends up forming, which again was initially looked at as a joke, but again, he was still the former of the committee, which, I mean, to be fair, was initially looked at as a joke, but considering how much they end up winning comps, ends up being the real alliance. While again, he clearly doesn't get his way at certain points in the game, he still is in this dominant alliance that runs the game in a pretty unprecedented way of them just steamrolling the competitions throughout the entire season. And he does get to a final 5 to where, again, like, had he gotten to the end, especially against Christmas or even Enzo like he had planned, like, he probably does win, though, too, for, again, like, he definitely did burn some jury votes for sure. But I do think he also would have had some jury votes as well, where, again, Memphis on that season did end up presenting a somewhat competent strategic mind. Again, a pretty good comp competitor, with essentially being back and forth between him and Cody, while also a not as great social player, but one that isn't entirely bad. So again, with Memphis here, he essentially does have 2 pretty strong runs, but neither of them are like truly elite runs in the game, especially in comparison to some of the people we're about to be talking about, who, while they may only have 1 appearance on the show, I think their 1 appearance is probably stronger than either of Memphis's appearances, which is enough for me to put Memphis here at number 31. Now, number 30, we're keeping off another runner-up of the show, though this one being a one-time player. But again, I think a one-time player that probably plays a better game in my mind than someone like a Memphis does on either of his seasons, and that person being Nicole from BB2. And again, Nicole to me plays a very impressive game considering the timing of her game. Again, considering it was BB2, the first true season of Big Brother to play a social strategy game, the fact that she was able to pick up on how to essentially float in the game, how to play the middle, how to also play a pretty dominant game. Again, all that is pretty impressive to me. Again, like early on, again, while she does ostracize herself at the very beginning and does become a clear target, she's able to flip the votes to keep her, organize this group against Chilltown. Again, that's pretty impressive. She also still, despite that, is able to play the middle following that, to where Chilltown actually starts to like her and builds bonds with the likes of Boogie and Shannon and Will, to where, again, they looked at her as one of their potential numbers down the road, which is pretty insane considering their rocky start. But then following that, she essentially forms this duo with Hardy that ends up running the game. Again, playing an extremely dominant game from that point forward, to where she is essentially using Hardy as a shield for a lot of that game, to where she recognized the fact that Hardy would go every single time if they're on the block together. While also, again, she built a strong bond with Will, to where Will wanted to keep her around, potentially to take her to final 2. But also that comes to the main criticism of her game and the fact that she probably loses everybody. And she's someone that was not well respected by the jury, to where, again, like, Will himself was not someone that was that loved by the jury. But again, in comparison to Nicole, obviously they adored Will in that instance. Again, they absolutely reviled Nicole in the game. But I do think her navigation through the game is, again, really, really impressive, demonstrating a lot of different approaches to the game of Big Brother, all in 1 appearance on the show, to where, again, I do find her 1 appearance here to be pretty impressive despite her complete lack of win equity, which is what lands her here at number 30. At number 29, we're moving on to a player that I did struggle a bit where to put this person, as, again, initially this person was actually higher on the list. This person was actually closer to the top 20, like being only a few spots away from it. However, at this point, they're again closer to the 30 range, but still pretty high on the list. I do have Michael Bruner. And Michael is an interesting player here in the sense that, again, he was a pretty competent strategic thinker. He was a pretty decent social player at points. He was playing the middle at a good chunk of the game. He, again, did do a lot right through the game. But obviously the main positive for Michael is the fact that his comp ability was ridiculous. I mean, I think Michael is by far the best comp competitor from Big Brother of all time. I think he is someone that just won so many different amount of comps and so many comps, to where I personally feel like Michael is probably the most consistent comp competitor in the history of the show, someone that I would, again, put the most faith in. And again, for someone that isn't that impressed by competition wins, I feel like Michael is one of the few that I am very impressed with what he was able to do in competition, just simply due to how dominant he was in them. But again, it's not like competitions were the only aspect of his game, where he didn't really even need a lot of the earlier competitions. In a lot of those positions, he would have been safe despite that. And to be fair, they did benefit him. They did allow him to have more outcomes that were more favorable to him. Obviously, it wouldn't have been ideal if he lost Brittany early on. But again, like, he was pretty safe throughout a lot of that early early game anyway. And again, I think he does a lot of good work in fracturing the leftovers and getting Kyle to have this vendetta against the likes of Joseph and Monty and get them to come after each other, which, I mean, to be fair, does play into some of the ickiness around his revealing of the Kyle information and kind of using that to his benefit, which, again, definitely not a good look. But his using of that information did end up proving to be a pretty beneficial move for him, getting rid of Kyle, his biggest threat in the game, someone that was actively coming for him and someone that had a lot of leverage in the game. So again, there was a point in the following week where he convinced Monty and Turner to keep him around, which again, it didn't stick, but I do think there's some good play there, and eventually he's obviously taking out Final Six, though again, like, that's kind of the name of the game when it comes to how sometimes competitions aren't in your favor. But again, I still feel like despite that, again, Michael is still the person I would have the most faith in and to win out on a season of Big Brother. Again, had they not gotten him out of 6, he probably does win out on that season and wins at the end. So again, I just look at Michael as a very well-rounded player, but one that again is just such a dominant force in competitions, while also someone that was so well positioned on his season. So again, for me, I do feel like that's enough to land him here at number 29. Now, number 28, we're moving on to a player that I do find a little bit tough to assess in the sense that this is a person that, again, could have potentially been a Big Brother winner had it not been for a very unfortunate twist towards the end of the game. But I do think the game surrounding that is, again, good, but definitely with some holes, and that person is Frankie Grande from BB16. And again, Frankie is someone that could have potentially won the game had the rewind button not existed, to where, again, had he gotten Victoria out at 5, he is in a very strong position to just win out. And had he won out, he probably would have taken Caleb to the end, to which he probably would have beaten him. Now, again, there's still a chance that he takes Derek and loses, but I do think for the most part, I think Frankie definitely had a winning trajectory in the game still, that he kind of got screwed over from. Now, beyond that, again, there's definitely holes to have with this game. The fact that he was openly targeting Zach multiple times, despite the fact that Zach was such a loyal ally to him. You also have him being really untrusted in the game by the middle portion, to where the likes of Derek and Cody had flipped on them during the Jocasta boot week, only for them to change their minds at the last second. But either way, I mean, like, he has a massive bullseye on his back to the point where he has to win the battle of the block to keep himself safe in the game. And while he's able to recover from that, again, those are definitely knocks against his game. But again, I do think there is a lot of really good social play from him, especially early on. Again, towards the end, he definitely gets a bit cocky and does have some dickish behavior, but he's obviously very good physically, with him winning a ridiculous amount of comps on that season. And mixing that with the fact that he later comes back for Reindeer Games and has a solid performance there. I mean, like, he's not the greatest position in that season, though again, he once again proves he is so good at competitions, possibly one of the best comp competitors of all time. So mixing now the fact that, again, he very much could have won. BB16 had that rewind week not happened, I do feel like, for me, I do look at him as a slightly better version of Michael, to where I think his comp ability is not that far apart from Michael's, while also having a season that, again, he very much could have won. So for me, again, that's enough to put him here at number 28. Now, number 27, we're moving back to a winner of the show, but a winner I do have a tough time assessing, as I do feel like this is a winner that, while they are very good at competitions that allow them to get to the end, while also having some decent social strategy at points, I feel like their winning game, though, is one of the most turbulent games in the history of the show, and that person is Jackson Mickey from BB21. And again, I just have a tough time fully grasping Jackson's game, in the sense that, again, like, early on, yeah, he was in the Majority Alliance, he was a pretty central figure within that Majority Alliance. It was also a Majority Alliance that eventually essentially kicks him out, to where by the time of week 5, again, he is clearly on the outs of that alliance and is blamed for the destruction of the 6 shooters, to which, I mean, he is fortunate in the fact that the other side recognizes this and decides to keep him around as someone that isn't in the core of it anymore and decides to target Jack instead. But again, it's a position where he definitely loses a lot of power there, and a lot of it due to him openly targeting Christy, which is just not a great move for him at that point in the game. And it's like really beyond that, I mean, really from the final 10 on, it's either him or Holly winning competitions really the rest of the season outside the final 6 round, to which again, he does build the bond with If and Nicole that really ends up allowing him to survive that round, which again, I'll definitely give him credit for the relationship he builds with Cliff. But a lot of his endgame stretch is essentially just him winning competitions. Now, again, I do think there is good play from him at points. I do think him repairing his relationship with Christy is pretty good. I think his relationship with Cliff and somehow not being targeted at 6 is pretty good. His final 5 move is obviously really very notable, and one that again is very impressive to see him pull off. Definitely a shining moment in terms of the social strategy aspects of the game. However, again, he's still someone that even in the end game, while he is steamrolling everyone else, I do think he has some pretty poor jury management to a point where I do think it would have definitely harmed him on a different season, but I think considering the season was immediately after Paul had lost and Tyler had lost, again, we did see this jury very much try to not be bitter. So I do think that definitely played a factor into Jackson still maintaining his jury votes by the end. But again, I think Jackson's game just as a whole is very rocky. Again, while he is in the majority early on, I don't think he plays particularly well from the majority. And then when he's from the bottom, he's essentially just winning comp after comp after comp. Though again, does have minor moments where he does make some pretty impressive moves. And again, just in general, he is still a very good comp competitor, which is definitely something to know here as well. To where again, despite the fact that I again do think his jury management is lacking and don't think he's the greatest social player in the world, again, for me, his dominance in competitions along with making some good moves here and there is enough to put him here at number 27. Now, number 26, we're moving on to a player that is another winner on the board and one that actually was higher in my initial draft of this list. However, after watching him on Reindeer Games, I did decide to drop him a bit, and that person is Xavier from BB23. And obviously, I've always criticized Xavier's BB23 game. So coming out of BB23, I did feel like Xavier was a player that, and there definitely was potential there, and it did seem like he could be a competent all-around player, but I do feel like he was very much lucked out by the cookout. And I always wondered how he would play if he didn't have the cookout, and I think we kind of saw that on Reindeer Games, where it didn't go particularly well. Like, while he'd obviously found himself in an alliance with Taylor, Danielle, and Josh, he was very clearly on the bottom of that alliance, where he was constantly thrown into Santa Showdown literally all but one time, really just kind of being utilized as a weapon in the game more so than a true, genuine ally, and him just, again, like kind of feeling like he was kind of aloof to what was actually going on in the game. And again, that kind of just feels about right for Xavier. That's kind of how I feel like he would play on a season without the cookout, to where it kind of justified some of those thoughts for me. As time goes on, I think a lot of people will glorify his win as him having dominated the game with the cookout. However, the reality is that he was very much lucked out by the cookout. Had it not been for the cookout, he does not win this season. Or he was just such a massive target by the mid game, to where if he did not have the cookout fully backing him, again, he definitely would have been sniped out around the time of the final 10, final 9, that sort of phase of the game. To where, again, the power players in the game didn't actually want to go to the end with Xavier, to where even by the time that the cookout gets to 6, they still are targeting Xavier, with Tiffany and Hannah directly coming for him. Kylan was coming for him until he wasn't, which even that I won't really give Xavier that much credit for, because that was mostly the work that other people were doing to actually target Xavier that just had the opposite effect on Kylan, where again, Kylan and Xavier didn't really have much of a connection until that point in the game. Now again, I do think Xavier does good work with Big D. I think he does good work with Azza to get them on side. But again, really for me, I think Xavier is a player that completely lucked out to his win. Now again, as a whole, I do think Xavier is a still very savvy player. He is one that can be cutthroat when he needs to. He can win a lot of challenges. He can be a decent strategist, but at the same time, I do feel like he has bad reads at points and doesn't fully get the actual landscape of the game. Again, I do feel like he is still competent strategically and is, again, a player that has the killer instinct. He's willing to make the moves necessary to go on to win the game. And again, socially, he's kind of this player that really gives a lot of nothing to people, and through that I think it makes it very clear when he's not really working with you. And also I think he can be a bit too trusting in thinking that his group has his back at all times, to where again I still feel like he was someone that was greatly benefited by a cookout, but even beyond that I do feel like he's still a very well-rounded player. But I just think his actual BB23 game is pretty mediocre, and because that is a bit tough to rank him here, where for me I did leave Xavier here at number 26. Now, number 25. We're moving on to a player that straight up, I mean, this person being this high might be biased on knowing this person's experience from other shows and that adding to my faith in this person, but still, I do have Cirie Fields. And again, Cirie obviously here is being affected by the fact that obviously I know how she plays on Survivor, how she plays on The Traitors. I know that she is a very good social strategy player. And through that, I think inherently it does elevate her position on this list. While again, this list is still an assessment of her Big Brother game and how she plays Big Brother, I do still think having the knowledge of how good of a social strategy player that she is still something that does, again, elevate my faith in her ability that allows her to be this high on the list. As I do think you could definitely argue the fact that this is too high for her, that she should be closer to maybe someone like a Brittany Haynes, or maybe closer to like the 40 to 50 range. However, again, I do think that is definitely something that plays a factor here. But even beyond that, like, I think her first half of her game is very impressive. While again, definitely qualm with how she handles the power and how flip-floppy she is, and she runs that first half of the game in a near unprecedented way. Again, she has such a stranglehold in the game where pretty much every single person in the house felt like they had some sort of connection to Cirie and was in a alliance with Cirie. And again, that is pretty insane. And while again it does crumble, again, I don't feel like she's that much at fault for it crumbling. Again, it crumbled while she was paired up to Felicia for 2 days straight, someone that was the target that week, so through that she couldn't really talk game while in that costume. Well, really, it was the likes of Jared that really blew up her game. And obviously, like, having Jared there is definitely a benefit for her, at least inherently, though obviously it doesn't end up playing to her favor by the end of it. And again, like, from that point on, she's more so playing a game of survival. She's simply just there trying to survive week by week, and again, does have some good play at points, does also have some bad play at points. Again, it is a little bit of a rockier game after that. So again, there's points where she is being ratted out by Blue constantly, but there's also points where she earns back the trust of Jag, despite the fact that Jag had no reason to actually trust her. However, again, the reason why I'm leaving her behind here over the like of the person that we're about to be talking about, who I think at the end of the day, like, I think her game is very similar to the next person we'll be talking about. However, I do think that person, one, had more of a chance of staying at the final 5, but even beyond that, probably had more win equity, to where I do think Cirie on this season probably does struggle with winning a jury vote had she gotten to the end against a Jag or a Matt. Again, her optimal path at the time that she gets taken out is for Matt to take her to the end. However, that's a situation that, again, I think she probably loses. So I think that's definitely something to calm with as well. But again, considering how dominant her first half of the game was, again, just my overall faith in her soul strategy ability, for me, it's enough to land her here at 25. Now, number 24, we have a person that I think is very comparable to Cirie in terms of how they played the Big Brother game, to where they also had a very dominant first half of the game, only for them to lose control in the second half, but still had some impressive moments within that. And that person is Tommy Bracco from BB21. Tommy, again, was in a very good spot for the first half of the game, where he was in the Dominant Alliance, he was in the Grateful Alliance, followed by the Six Shooters. He was pretty much a central figure within that. He was super close to the likes of Christy and Jack, had a good relationship with Holly. Again, he was a pretty central figure early on, and obviously his game is a bit ruined by the dissolution of the Six Shooters, which, I mean, to be fair, he played a role in that, but I do feel like beyond that, again, like, his game's still not entirely bad. I mean, even at that point, he still had about half the house on his side. Again, still had the likes of Christy, Jack, Annalise, still had a relationship with Holly and Nick. But I think at that point, he was largely harmed by the fact that his side just simply didn't win any competitions, so where it was more so the Jackson and Holly side of things that was winning comp after comp after comp, and through that, he lost his numbers one by one by one. So the one time he did win a competition, he does make a somewhat optimal move in taking out a person from the opposite side, and also uses the veto on Christy, despite people telling him not to. And again, I do think he even plays, like, again, somewhat optimally during that portion of the game, and even then is somehow still the last standing of his alliance, despite the fact that, again, he had the closest relationship with most of those people. So again, the fact that he even makes it to final 5 is pretty impressive, considering his side hadn't had an HOH in multiple rounds at that point, to where while he does get taken out at final 5, even that is like a very wonky circumstance that the vote had almost flipped, with that essentially being him being outplayed by Jackson that one instance. So I think for most of the game, he was outplaying Jackson. Again, he wins over the loyalty of Jack over Jackson, and it's just better positioned than him for most of the game. So again, I do think Tommy's game, his main failing is the fact that he couldn't win any of those endgame competitions. But again, in comparison to Cirie, again, I think their games are somewhat similar. Again, the fact that they had this dominant alliance at the very beginning, and to be fair, I think Cirie probably had more of a stranglehold than Tommy did early on, but I think Tommy's eventual elimination is a lot more wonky. And even beyond that, again, I think Tommy's probably more competent in competitions, where again, Cirie never won a single competition. Well, I feel like Tommy can at least win competitions. So again, I feel like in terms of those things, it's enough for me to put Tommy one spot above her at number 24. At number 23, we're moving on to the newest player left on the board, the only player from BB25, and that player is Matt. And Matt is an interesting player here in the fact that I think a lot of people would obviously not agree with the fact that he is this high on the list. I think a lot of people talk about how he was such a passive player and let Jag do everything. And again, I just personally disagree with that assessment. And I do think Matt, just as a whole, plays a very solid game of Big Brother. Now, again, there are definitely flaws. I think he definitely lacks ownership of his game. I mean, his jury management is particularly terrible. And from what we learned, it does seem like he lost the game pretty much solely because of his goodbye messages to Blue in America, where he tried to pretend like he didn't have anything to do with their eliminations and wanted to blame it all on Jag, which, again, it's funny that that is actually a tactic he used earlier in the game. That actually was good for his game, as it made Jag a bigger target ahead of him, though by the end of the game, it obviously causes him to lose jury respect. But again, Matt is just such an interesting case to where, while he does start off the game a bit rocky, I mean, by the time of week 3, he really is in this central position in the house, being one of the safest people in the entire game, and even getting on Sari's good side to the point where Sari actually talks about taking him to 3 over Izzy, which is pure insanity there. Again, I think his social game, particularly in terms of really bonding with the people in power, is just a very impressive aspect of his game. And by the time that the flip against Izzy occurs, he's essentially the safest person in the game. He's the person that literally has nobody coming after him while having almost everyone wanting to work with him. He has the likes of Corey and America wanting to work with him. He obviously has Jag and Blue. He has Cameron. He has Sari. Like, there are just so many factions that want to work with Matt at that point. And once Izzy flip happens, which is something that's actually not good for Matt's game, he's still able to fully recover from that and become in the central position once again after not even a week's time, and building a bond with Cameron once again, despite the fact that he hated him and always wanted him out. He still has Corey and America on his side. He connects back up with Sari. And again, there are impressive aspects of his game in the middle portion of the game. Again, the fact that he got Jared to pick him for the veto, only to then not use the veto on him and take him out. He did lead the charge against Cameron to where he was the one to get Jag on board to target Cameron to begin with. And really, he was the one that had all the social capital to allow Jag to make the moves that Jag supposedly made. And where had it not been for Matt, Cameron would not have been on board with getting rid of Mimi. And people like to criticize the fact that he let Sari go, and that was actually probably the optimal move for him. He had no real other option, knowing that Jag was just going to win all the competitions anyway. So him letting go of Sari was the most optimal way for him to actually have Jag still take him to the final 2, which he did, despite the fact that people were telling him that Matt was going to beat him at the end, which is still insane to me. Yeah, I think Matt's game is extremely impressive. Now, obviously, he loses the game due to his bad jury management and his goodbye messages, which, again, is purely his fault. But I mean, like, that's also a fault I have with another person much higher on this list. And again, straight up, like, Matt is still a flawed player, but I do think in comparison to the grand scheme of Big Brother, I do think he is a very, very good player. Or simply put, again, most Big Brother players are bad. For Matt being here, again, while it may seem surprising, to me, I fully stand by this pick, as I do feel like he is a very consistent player. I feel like he would be able to play this game over and over and over again. Or had he only tightened up his jury management, I do feel like he is a very likely winner on a lot of seasons, and on this specific season would have played a very impressive game had he actually won, to where for me he's here number 23. Number 22, we're finally going back to a winner of the show here. A winner that I did debate on where exactly I land this person. I do feel like there are a lot of pros to this person and there's a lot of cons to this person's game. I think this person is pretty high variance. I think this person could easily be one of the first few boots of the season, or they can go on to win as they did on their season. I think their actual win was one that was, again, pretty impressive. And that person is Steve Moses from BB17. And Steve is a player that largely gets tied into the likes of an Ian. And Steve is someone that a lot of people like to compare to Ian. However, I personally feel like there is a massive distinction between the two, particularly in their winning games. Again, Ian is someone that was aloof for the entire game, was on the bottom, had to win competition. Steve was someone that was in the majority alliance and actively was on the bottom of the majority alliance. Again, something about Steve is that he outlines his strategy from the very beginning of the season, ends up executing it to a T. He openly states that he wants to be on the bottom of a majority alliance in a split house so that he can not be the target from the opposing alliance, while obviously not being a target from his own alliance, while also building a strong final 2 with the person at the top of that alliance. And again, he literally does exactly that and executes it pretty perfectly. So again, he is working with the likes of Vanessa and the Oz twins and Shelly and Clay, though again, at that point, is a bit of an understated member of that alliance. And then, to be fair, I mean, I do think his game gets a little bit rocky when like Johnny Mac goes, and when Austin and Liz and Julia had a deal with James and Meg that, again, like could potentially put him in danger. But again, he's able to recover from that. Johnny Mac comes back, which again was very fortunate for him, but eventually they're able to get Vanessa to go after the Oz twins, and the fact that Vanessa ends up blindsiding Austin in favor of Steve, I think, is a big pro there, which, I mean, to be fair, on paper, like strategically, you would definitely think that is the correct move to make. And again, he obviously snipes Vanessa out of the game, something that really obviously propels his game. The main reason why he wins the game. The fact that he was able to trick Vanessa the entire season into thinking that he would take her to final 2, only for him to cut her at the end. Again, I think Steve plays a very, very impressive game. Now, again, I think in the grand scheme of things, I would feel like he's a bit of a high variance player. I feel like he is one that could definitely go home early. And again, even on this season, again, he was on the block week 1. And to be fair, I mean, there was always the backdoor plan for Jace, but again, had Nam stayed the same, I think he would have been in danger there. But again, I do think he is a high variance player. However, I do think the game he actually played on BB17 was a pretty impressive one. And because of that, for me, he is here number 22. Now, number 21, we have a player that is obviously one of the most popular players of all time, though was one I always questioned on where exactly to land this person, considering their win felt like one that was very turbulent and through that became very tough to assess, though considering their recent recent appearance on Big Brother Reindeer Games at 21, I am going to go with Taylor Hale. Again, if she were to play again, I think she would do very well. I do have a lot of faith in Taylor's just overall game ability and her just being very likable socially and her being competent enough strategically and physically. Where, I mean, to be fair, there definitely are qualms we had there. I mean, physically, she didn't win many comps on her season, though, to be fair, again, she was facing off against the likes of Monty and Michael, who are two of the better comp competitors in the history of the show. And also strategically, again, like, there are points where she was okay. Again, she knew to get rid of Michael when she needed to, but she was also at points really bad, like her HOH reign, where, and she considered putting up Joseph on the block in a position where he could have gone home. And just all around, again, her actual game on BB24 isn't that good. I mean, it is one where, again, like, instantly she's an outcast. So again, like, I don't think that's the norm. I think this was just a weird circumstance to where Taylor was just instantly isolated. For most instances, I do feel like she would be pretty well liked by the cast. Though obviously it still happened on her season where she was just on the bottom for first few weeks. Gets very much benefited by the creation of the leftovers, which, again, while the show props it up as it was made to go against the bullying of Taylor, in reality it wasn't. It was made because the likes of Kyle Monty thought it was better for their game. And there is a very good player in Taylor, but I feel like the game that we actually got was one that wasn't that great. Even though, again, there is some decent work at the end, again, getting Monty to take it to the end, but even then, even that would qualm in the fact that that was a position where even she had thought that Turner was like the biggest threat on the board. So really the entire house was misguided in that light. But obviously beats Monty in a pretty impressive way there. And again, does get Monty and Turner to change their minds about Michael and target him at the double eviction. To be fair, she does lose the trust of Brittany along the way. And again, like, it's just a very rocky game. But really, again, I come out of BB24 looking at Taylor's game as one that is like a lot of potential, but one that we never truly got to see just due to the wonky circumstances that happened there. But I feel like we got to see some of that potential on Reindeer Games. Reindeer Games, I feel like, gave us a better view of Taylor's games, seeing her do extremely well socially on that season, being very safe throughout the entire game, again, being the only person to not go into a Santa showdown the entire season, while then proceed to make it to the very end, again, winning some of these more equitable competitions, something to definitely give her credit for. Now, again, I still do feel like after Reindeer Games, I am still pretty low in her strategic ability. I do feel like strategically she was making decisions that I didn't necessarily agree with, and even then I feel like she had some very weird rationale for things, to where, again, I still don't look at her as the great strategic thinker, but I do think her social ability has been further confirmed through her appearance on Reindeer Games, where also, again, I think if she's on a season that has equitable comps, I feel like she could also be a decent comp competitor as well, where, again, I do feel like through that it has elevated my opinion on Taylor. Now, I will say I did want to put her a little bit higher, but I just feel like I couldn't, especially over the next person we'll be talking about, who I do look at as a player on a similar caliber, even though the next person's a little bit more passive in the game, but I do feel like that person is probably just an all-around better comp competitor, while in the modern day probably being a, again, relatively similar player to Taylor. For while I did want to put Taylor a little bit higher, I felt like I had to leave her behind here at number 21. Now, number 20, we're moving on to, again, a winner I find very similar in terms of my overall thoughts on their game ability, and that person is Casey from BB20. And Casey, I think, is just an interesting player in the fact that she obviously dominates the game alongside Tyler. However, again, obviously, I think it was a lot more of the work that Tyler did that got them to the end. While, again, Tyler was literally just giving orders to Casey, and Casey would execute them. Again, she would do that. And through that, it would actually gain her social capital in the game, and her being told to build relationships with the likes of Bailey and Sam that actually gained her their jury votes by the end. But again, I do feel like a lot of her game is not very passive. It's a lot of her just doing what she's told, and when she's not, she's simply just there. Where, again, I think Casey also wins, again, largely due to luck. Again, her being able to win a whole bunch of challenges in the end game, along with the fact that Tyler didn't have more time to explain his game at the very end. So again, Tyler literally gains a jury vote over the course of jury questioning, where even Bailey said that she was starting to question her vote, and had Haley talk to Fessy, I think there's a chance that Fessy changes his vote. To where, again, like, I do feel like Casey's win is a very, very rocky one, but I do think something that's propping her up for me is what we've seen on the challenge. Now, not necessarily, obviously, how she's performed on the challenge as like, oh, she's a challenge winner, that's why she's higher on this list. It's more so the fact that I think she's shown that she's able to do pretty much the same thing again with a different group of people. She's able to essentially repeat her social game on another show, but really in an even more impressive way on the challenge. So again, the challenge alumni adore Casey, and she's someone that you, again, never hear any negative words about from the alumni. And when watching her play the game, everyone wants to work with Casey. People respect Casey. And I feel like that is something that is on my mind here when assessing Casey, is the fact that, again, I do think if she were to play again, I think she would do very well. I think she would be very well positioned in the game and have a lot of people like her. And I think as time has gone on, I also feel like she's gained a little bit more of a game-centric mind as well, where I think she is starting to play a bit more strategically when she is on the challenge, where, again, I think her game ability is increasing as well for a return on Big Brother, where, again, is that a fair justification of putting her higher on this list, especially when we haven't seen it on the actual show of Big Brother? Again, you can definitely question that, but I do feel like personally, Casey has demonstrated more of her social ability while also, again, gaining a bit of a strategic edge. For me, it is enough to put Casey here at number 20. Now, number 19, we're moving on to a player that I think there's a bit of an overreaction in how people look at this player, to where, again, while, again, not supporting the things they do in real life, I mean, when assessing their game, I think a lot of people think that certain other person did all the work for this person. However, I pretty much disagree with that, and that person is Mike Boogie from, obviously, BB's 2, 7, and 14. And obviously, he's this high due to his BB7 game. I mean, that's really his only great game of the three. And again, I think BB7, people like to claim that, oh, it was just Dr. Will doing everything and Boogie was dragged along, and that's simply just not the case. I mean, Boogie was actually probably the more active player of the two, the one that did a lot more of the legwork for the duo, and also I think was a more sound strategic mind in the game than Will at points, so where, again, I think Boogie is a much better player on BB7 than people like to give him credit for. Now, would he be there without Will? No. I mean, he would not have been cast, but it doesn't change the fact that, again, when he was there, I think he plays extremely well. I think his BB7 game, while flawed at the very, very end, and also flawed in the sense that he would have taken Will to the end, I think is a mostly strong game there. Now, beyond that, I do think, again, BB2, I think it's obviously a very questionable game, though I still think there's some upsides there. Again, the fact that he instantly clocked the strategy of using a pawn from the very beginning, and that was the first time that was even able to be utilized, and for him to know that strategy right away is good. And I think it always came off to me as Boogie having this decent strategic mind right from the offset, though it was just pretty overly cocky in the game, to where, again, people didn't like Chilltown and wanted to do whatever he didn't want to do, which is bad. But even then, survives a few more rounds. It isn't targeted over Will and Shannon in week 3, only be targeted the following week, seemingly because of his connection to Krista. But again, then we get his BB14 game, which I actually think is better than people claim. Again, yeah, he's taken out right before the jury, but even then, I think he does some pretty good things. I mean, he leads the charge against Janelle. He helps in the flip against Willie. He is a very active participant in the game, even when he's just a coach. And while, again, at the end of the day, he is outplayed by the likes of Dan, Danielle, Shane, and Brittany, I do think as a whole, his game is pretty solid considering the massive target that was on his back there. So I think Boogie's a better player than most people give him credit for. Again, not supporting him as a person outside the show, but I do think his game is one that is a bit too trashed on. So because of that, for me, he's here number 19. Number 18, we're moving on to a player that has a very impressive aspect of their game, though outside that, I do question their game as a whole, but still relatively high here. At number 18, I do have Maggie from BB6. And Maggie's obviously a player that is commonly looked at as a cult leader, and how she weaponized the elimination of Eric to really dominate the game. And yeah, again, I think that is the main pro of Maggie. The fact that she really controlled the early portions of the game. I'm really one of the only early dominant winners of Big Brother. Again, a game that is very hard to dominate, though even then, you can qualm if she did dominate, considering, again, she had a lot of control over her side, and her side was the winning side. But I think my major issue with Maggie is that Big Brother's also a game where you need to be good with everybody. I mean, if you're not good with everybody, then anybody can just get power at any point and then put you on the block, to where I think that is a major issue for me with Maggie, is the fact that she essentially ostracizes half the house. Half the house absolutely hated her and did not want anything to do with her. So while she does win at the end, she only wins because she's against Yvette, someone that was hated even more by some of the jury. So Maggie was just someone that was not really well liked on the season. To where I think Maggie is someone that I think her game is probably more acclimated to something like Survivor than it is Big Brother. But still, her Big Brother game, again, is a very dominant one. I give her a lot of credit for Howie turning on James, which was an astronomically dumb move from Howie that allowed her to gain leverage coming into the jury phase of the game, which essentially had them guarantee that the friendship would win the game by the end of it. And even then, she was still not particularly looked at as a threat, to where she was never really targeted throughout most of the game. Though, to be fair, potentially would have been had Jennifer not blown up her spot even more, which, to be fair, I mean, Maggie obviously played a factor in getting Jennifer to blow up her spot. But really, I think Maggie gets to a final two situation where, again, it's one of the few final two situations I could see her winning against Yvette. I mean, I think she could also probably win against against Janelle, obviously. But I think against the likes of April or even Bo, I think she probably does struggle to win at the end there. So again, people just simply did not like her and did not want her to win. But again, when against Yvette, obviously the likes of Rachel and Howie end up voting for her anyway. But still, I do think her game is still a very mixed one, where again, while it is a very dominant game, I think there are problems for me, especially in the grand scheme of Big Brother, and the fact that she had half the house hating her, which again, like for a Big Brother player is not a good trait in a game that the power can shift constantly. So because of that, for me, despite her dominant win, I do leave her back here at number 18. At number 17, we're going to be running through some of the best one-time non-winning players, starting it all off with a player that played a game that was ahead of his time, and that person is Jason Guy from BB3. And obviously Jason worked alongside Danielle Reyes and really dominated the game alongside Danielle Reyes. And truth be told, I mean, after my latest BB3 rewatch, I would give more of the credit to Danielle than with Jason. However, Jason in himself is also a very competent player, one that is a very strategic player in the game, one that, again, can win competitions, and one that is really good socially, really well loved by the majority of his cast, to where had he gotten to the end, I think he beats almost everybody on the season, to where even looking at Express, even despite him having blindsided people and people having seen the show and seeing his more cutthroat side, they still were pro Jason. So I think that is something to give a lot of credit to. Now, I do think outside that, I think there are some minor issues here and there. Again, I do think it is mostly Danielle that is leading the charge in their maneuverings through the game. I do also feel like there are points where Jason doesn't really make the optimal move. Again, he doesn't target Roddy during his HOH because he feels bad, and I feel like that's also not particularly great. But again, he's still a very, very strong all-around player. Again, leads the charge in the blindsiding of Marcellus, which is obviously a very savage move there. A move that Danielle made to keep Jason safe, which I do think is an impressive aspect of that as well. Where, again, really just the amount of trust he was able to gain with Danielle and have Danielle wanting actively take him to the end despite her losing to him, again, is pretty good. Where he was literally one mistake away from just winning the game. If they had voted out Lisa over Amy, he does win the game. And otherwise, again, even in that Final 3 situation, he really just needs one of him or Danielle to win final HOH, and he wins the game there anyway. And again, Jason is still a very, very impressive player. One that, again, I still have those minor issues with him. I do think there are points where he plays emotionally, but I do think as a whole, he's a very competent all-around player ahead of his time, and because of that, for me, he's here number 17. Number 16, moving on to a more recent player. This player being one that I think would have won their season had not been for very wonky circumstances, and that person is Tiffany from BB23. And again, Tiffany's a player that I think people try to downplay Tiffany's game after the fact and kind of prop up Xavier's game, but in reality, I think Tiffany outplayed Xavier during most aspects of the game. I think the point that she didn't was obviously the very end, at the point that the cookout got the final 6, which was a situation that Tiffany herself knew was bad for her game. And that's the thing about Tiffany, is that she played a game that she knew was not optimal for her game, but did it obviously due to real life reasons. And I'm not going to fault her for doing so, especially considering the political climate at the time that she did it, to where it obviously makes a lot of sense that she would want to represent for her community, but it is still the main reason why I do think she loses the game. Had she played the game more naturally and worked alongside the likes of Claire and DX and Hannah, I think she more than likely gets to the end of the game in a position where she probably wins the game. Now, I think the main thing that would probably stop her there is the fact that DX could have won out, and DX probably would have beaten her through that, but even then, I think it would have been at least a somewhat close vote. But again, she was just someone that had so much respect from the house. People adored her in the house. She was so well positioned during the first few weeks, where she had so many options in the game, so many good options in the game. Again, had obviously the cookout. She had the relationship with DX and Claire. She had a relationship with Sarah Beth and had like a final 3 with her and Claire. She even had a good connection with Frenchie early on. She had her duo of Kylan. She had a relationship with Hannah. She was just, again, so expertly positioned in the game. Her biggest flaws were the fact that she did not get along with Big D, and she had a very wonky relationship with Xavier, to where, I mean, it was pretty clear by the time they got to the final 6 they were going to go after each other. But even then, had a mixed relationship with Azah as well, which again is the issue, is the fact that her bad relationships in the game, her very few bad relationships, were to people in the cookout, which makes it even more frustrating that we never really got to see her live up to her potential because of that. Now, again, at the end of the day, yeah, it is a flaw, the fact that she was planning on going to the end of the cookout and couldn't get the cookout to be a position that benefited her the most, but I still think that's a position that she wouldn't need to be in if it wasn't for the political climate at the time, to where if she was able to play her game for herself in the way that she wanted people to be able to down the road, which was the entire point of the cookout to begin with, is to produce the first ever black winner so that people wouldn't have to do this sort of thing down the road, to where, again, it just feels like she gives up her game for a greater cause, which again, I'm not going to falter for, especially when again, it felt like all the pieces were there for her to just outright dominate the game. So again, she's a player that I do consider to be one of the best players to never win, and a player that could have very much won had she been in a spot to play the game more so for herself, but because she doesn't go on the win, and again, does demonstrate some flaws here and there. Again, for me, it's still enough to put her here at number 16. Now, number 15, again, a similar player to me, a player that also had a lot of potential to win the game, probably would have won their season had it not been for an outside circumstance, though this one obviously being a lot less personal and being more production-based. And at number 15, we do have Eric Stein. And again, Eric Stein is a player that I think he would have won BB8 had he not been for America's Player Twist. I think he would have easily dominated the season. Again, the fact that he gets backdoored by Dick and Danielle and his entire group goes out of their way to save him is a very impressive aspect of his game there. And even beyond that, again, like was able to navigate through the game pretty freely. Again, doing what America wanted him to do, which again, he recognized was not in his best interest, but was still able to execute on that pretty well. Again, the fact that he was able to get Dick and Danielle back on his side and work with them for a few weeks. The fact that he was able to throw these hinky votes at the beginning without much suspicion. And just as a whole, again, Eric, I think, plays a very impressive game. Now, I think probably a qualm for me is the fact that I do think it's not a very repeatable game. I don't know if he's able to do that on most appearances, but considering the one appearance he had, again, he played an extremely dominant game that would have won him the game had he not had America force him to play the way he did. And even despite that, again, like he still was in this position had he been able to use the veto at Final 7, which again, America wasn't allowed to even have a say in that, and he was just told that he couldn't use the veto. It was still a position where that could have gotten Danielle out that week, and through that, probably have a much smoother ride to the end of the game. So again, it just feels like he was just screwed over by production over and over and over again. Now again, like Tiffany, there are still the flaws that he couldn't build enough strong bonds around him to still get him to the end despite that fact. But again, that would have been him overcoming a lot of adversity. Though again, I think the big flaw here is the fact that he wasn't able to keep Zach on board. He never really had much relation with Zach, and the fact that he was never able to build one while Dick and Danielle had one. Again, that is definitely an issue there. But I think considering the circumstances around his game, I think he plays the game very well. A very dominant player until the point where America screwed him over. And because that for me is here number 15. Now number 14, we're moving on to a player that I will say I do think my overall faith in this person's game ability is less than the last few people we've talked about. However, this person does have 2 appearances on the show, both making it to the very end, and that person is Enzo from BB's 12 and 22. And Enzo obviously is a player that, while yes, I do feel like he struggles with winning the game, he is someone that, while he is very well liked in the house, I think he struggles with garnering respect. However, I do think Enzo is still a very consistent player. We've seen him play 2 times now. First time being one of the most dominant alliances in the history of the show in the Brigade, and being the person that founded that alliance while making it all the way to Final 3. Only to be taken out in a situation where it wasn't really even the best move for the person that made the move. Still, like, I was in a position where he couldn't win the game. I don't think he could win the game if he got to the end. People did not respect his game, even though, again, I think he played a very impressive game on that season. But then he comes back for 22, where I think he improves his game in pretty much every single way. I think he's better socially with more of the house. I think he does play the game more strategically, especially early on, where I think he was a more individualistic player there. And again, he started to win comps as well. Not obviously not as good as Cody, which is an issue, but still, I do think he ups his game in pretty much every way on BB22. The issue is the fact that, again, he had the likes of Cody next to him, and I think by the end, he kind of was just kind of catering to what Cody wanted and wanted to go to the end of Cody in a position where, again, he would have lost to Cody. And again, that is a major issue there, because I do think on BB22, unlike BB12, I think he had winning scenarios. I think he could have won the game. Had he gotten to the end of Christmas, I think he outright wins. Even against Nicole, I think there's a shot there. But the fact that he wanted to actively go to the end against Cody to where he gets shut out, again, like, that is an issue. But again, he does have 2 very deep runs on the season, both runs being very impressive and very different. Both runs being pretty impressive, both having him be in this dominant alliance that completely steamrolls the season. So again, like, Enzo's track record is really, really good. It's just the problem is that, again, I do feel like he just lacks a bit of that killer instinct to truly win the game. But I do feel like, again, if he were to play again, I would expect him to be Final 2, Final 3 once again. So I just feel like he is a very consistent player in the game of Big Brother while still having outs to win, where for me, it is enough to put him here at number 14. Now, number 13, we're moving on to a player that I think my opinion of this player definitely went up after my latest rewatch of their season, where this is a player that originally on the list was around the like 18, 19 sort of spots, around where like Maggie and Boogie were. However, I did elevate them on this list after my rewatch of their season. That person is Drew from BB5. And again, I think Drew Drew is actually a much more impressive game than I remembered. I mean, he is a player that definitely has some wonky strategic thoughts at points. Again, is obviously very good at challenges, but even beyond that, is very good socially, to a degree that I did not even remember how good he was socially. To where again, despite the fact that early on in the season he's very latched on to the likes of Scott and Jace as part of the Horsemen, he's actually still someone that is working on the other side. He's really just playing the middle for a lot of that early game, and him still having connections to the likes of like a Diane and an Adria, Natalie. For again, he has this other option after the Horsemen go home and working with the Twin Alliance. And while the Twin Alliance doesn't fully stick through, he's still able to utilize the twins as shields while also using them to get rid of Will, which is definitely something in his best interest. Following that, he still has Diane as someone to help him through the game, to where Diane ends up really fighting for him to the point where somehow Nokomis and Karen don't end up targeting them, which is pure insanity there. And Diane ends up going all in on Drew, to where they end up making the move at Final 5 to get rid of Karen. That essentially puts Drew in a perfect position to win the game, where he does end up getting to a perfect Final 3 with him and Diane and Cowboy, to where neither of them are taking each other. Both of them take him to the end, and he probably beats both of them. Now, the thing is that he does win Final HOH, which I don't think is actually even the optimal move there, as he does end up cutting Diane, which, I'm to be fair, does show killer instinct in the game there, but also it does potentially burn his relationship with Diane, which, again, it doesn't by the end, but I do think that was a suboptimal move there. And again, I think that's the thing with Drew's game. I think he is a very naturally good Big Brother player, a very well-rounded Big Brother player, one that has very good instincts for the game, but I do think there are some points where he does mess up strategically, but still, I do think he's a very good social player, one that, again, I think probably wins in the end against most people. I think the only person I see him actually losing to is probably Karen. Even then, I think it's a close vote. Like, really, I think Drew plays a very, very impressive game. So again, had he been just a little bit more strategically savvy, I would have put him higher on this list, but I do think his game as a whole is, again, a very impressive one, to where I do look at him as a very well-rounded, all-around player, and because of that, for me, he is here number 13. Now, number 12. So from this point on, I think these are like truly the best of the best. I think these are truly elite players of Big Brother. For a while, again, there's still issues to be had with these people. I still think as a whole, these are really, really great players, all of which I believe I've had in my top 10 at one point or another. But at number 12, we're going to be starting that off with another old school winner off the board. Here we're going with Junsong. And Junsong is a player that I do have a lot to praise. I do think strategically for the time, I think she was well ahead of her time. I think she really floated through the game pretty expertly, to where, again, like, I definitely would give Allison some credit as well for the foundation of the floater strategy, though I think June was the one to really perfect it by the end of the season and was able to really undermine Allie throughout a lot of that game, to where she comes into the end winning simply because people respected her game more. Where a common thing that's talked about this season is how much people hated the final two, which that is the case, and that is a fault for me with June's game. The fact that the jury hated her and didn't really want her to win. I do think she struggles with winning against most other people, and she obviously gets to the final two with Allie, in a spot where, again, Allie does make the final two with her. But still, like, gets to the final two with obviously her optimal final two partner. But again, a lot of talk is how, oh, they voted for her because she was the lesser two evils, when, like, kind of the reality is that she was voted for because people respected her game more than Allie. Not because they particularly liked her more than Allie, but because, again, the way that June was able to navigate through the game was in a way that made Allie look like she was doing things for June's best interest. I do think June's navigation through the game and getting Allie to make these moves that seem like mistakes for Allie's game while propping up June's game, again, is an impressive aspect of her game. Now, again, I definitely do still have holes with the fact that she was not the most likable presence in the house. Again, people did call her annoying and she would get to some fights for no reason, but I do think as a whole, June is a very, very solid player on BB4, and I think a player that, if she were to return, I would have a good amount of faith in her. Again, I do think she is probably one of the most strategically sound players in the history of the show, to where, while I don't look at her as the best social player in the world, even though she's not terrible, but also, again, like, not that great at competitions, yeah, for me, I think her really heightened strategic ability for me is what lands her here number 12. Now, number 11, we're moving on to another player that has a very heightened strategic acumen in the game, and that person is obviously Vanessa Russo from BB17. And again, Vanessa, in my opinion, for her game has largely stayed the same over time. I think it's a very impressive game, one that has her making the correct strategic call throughout most of her season. I think she's obviously a very rational mind, of person who understands game theory and really utilizes that to her benefit. She's also very good at competitions, where, again, usually people talk about Vanessa as a strategic mastermind, but I think one of her bigger pros in her game is the fact that she was also able to win comps, even at points where people were targeting her, and that is kind of a fault in Vanessa's game, is I do think there are probably more points where people are targeting Vanessa than the likes of June or Drew, who we've already talked about, or really any of the people that we're about to be talking about through their more dominant games. But I think Vanessa is also, again, like, just very good physically, while, again, was able to get her way out of even these sticky situations. Again, she was backdoored, and, like, technically not really because she played in the veto, but still, like, she ends up surviving that. Now, to be fair, I mean, I think that was a lot more of the fault of Shelly than it was on Vanessa, but still, I think Vanessa didn't mess it up. And again, it's still a pretty impressive thing to recover from, as, again, from that point forward, she really regroups with the Oz twins, and they really end up just steamrolling a lot of the game following that, only for it to eventually flip on the Oz twins, which I do think is obviously the optimal move, which I do think your flip on Austin in particular is a very impressive move there, one that does put her in a much better spot for the end game, to where, I mean, I think that is kind of an issue for me, though, is the fact that I do think she was never going to be in that good of a position in the end game. She was always this person that was going to struggle finding herself in a perfect end game scenario where both people were going to take her, because you always had the likes of Steve and Johnny Mac, who recognized the threat that Vanessa was and was going to take her out of the game at 3. You had the likes of Austin, Liz, and Julia, who all had other options, other people that were more loyal to her. Again, if anything, I'll say that's probably my biggest flaw of Vanessa's game, the fact that she wasn't able to build up this undying loyalty from people to guarantee herself a position at the end of the game, but she was still guaranteed to win the game had she made it to the end. Sure, that's impressive as well. Where, again, like, Vanessa is a very, very impressive player, one of the best strategic players we've ever seen, also very good physically, to where, again, for me, it is enough to put her here number 11. And now we're at the top 10, which, I mean, straight up, my top 10 has not really changed that much since the last time I did a top 10 player ranking. I feel like there's only like one major change. Everything else is around the same, but we'll still talk through it anyway. And really, we're going to be wrapping up the non-winners at the beginning of the top 10 here, but we're going to be starting that off with, obviously, a legend of the game from Big Brother 3. We do have Danielle Reyes. And Danielle Reyes, I think, plays a very, very impressive BB3 game. Her BB3 game is one where she just dominates for most of that season. Again, creates the Secret Alliance, a concept that really ends up pushing the evolution of Big Brother strategy and ends up, again, being perfectly positioned in the game by the end. The problem is win equity, where really I feel like the only person she actually beats is Amy. She obviously loses to Lisa, and I think she definitely loses to Jason, which sadly is the final 3 situation she wanted to go to. So I think that's something to definitely criticize from Danielle, especially is the fact that she fought so hard to get to the end of the game in a position where she was actively going to lose. Again, like, knowing she would lose against Jason, like, having a good idea she would lose against Lisa, but still went to the end with them anyway. But still, again, her navigation through the game is very impressive. Again, the fact that she was able to build these really strong bonds with the likes of Marcellus and with Kiara, and even Jerry thought he had a good relationship with her, to where she ends up taking them all out, obviously. And obviously her move against Marcellus is one of the most savage moves in the game, though, again, one that I don't think is necessarily in her best interest, against a move that she does to save Jason. Well, Marcellus was someone that was loyal to her. Well, Marcellus was someone that was seemingly loyal to her, even though, to be fair, he did talk about potentially going for her at points. And like, I think Danielle's BB3 game is very impressive. There's obviously holes to pick, especially considering the fact that, again, she also knew that people were going to be watching from home, so her trashing people in the diary rooms was a pretty terrible move just from a game perspective. But then she comes back for BB7, which, to be fair, her BB7 game is not nearly as good, but I do think it shows us repeatability. It shows us that she was able to make it far into the game once again, despite having a massive target on her back from the very beginning. And while, again, I think there definitely are things to criticize from that game, the fact that she was a bit too loyal to the Legion of Doom, the fact that she was unsuccessful in getting Erica, her closest ally, to keep her in the game, the fact that early on she was not really that well positioned in the game and struggled to really gain any traction in the game until midway through. Again, like, those are definitely criticisms to be had, but I do feel like Danielle still, again, plays a solid game to where I think she would have gotten to the end somehow from the final 6 on. I think she probably wins the game. I mean, at least if she's not at the end against Will or maybe Boogie, but yeah, I do think she's a very likely winner of that season if she somehow got to the end. And when adding in reindeer games, it's a bit of a mixed bag here. It's one where I think there's very impressive aspects of her game there, where she was pretty much in the middle of the house from the beginning of the game, again, aligned with the likes of Brittany, but also having the Josh, Taylor, Xavier alliance as well. She had people that actively wanted to protect her in the game, though I think something to definitely fault her for is the fact that she gets caught playing both sides, and Brittany does target her, despite the fact that she was fully loyal to Brittany. And again, that is bad, to where, again, I think her reindeer games game is a bit of a mixed bag, though So it's one that doesn't really affect her too much on this list. But either way, again, I do feel like Danielle Reyes is still an all-time great player here. She's someone that understood most aspects of the game from very early on. It's just a shame she didn't really understand the jury management portion of the game. To her, obviously, she is a legend of the game, really one of the founders of Big Brother strategy, and because of that, for me, she's here number 10. At number 9, we're moving on to a player that I've always debated between this person and the next person we'll be talking about. Both two-time players, both playing two pretty solid games, even though flawed, though one of them is certainly much better than the other. But at number 9, I'm going to go with Paul. Obviously from BB 18 and 19, to where Paul's 19 game is one of the most dominant games in the history of the show. I mean, they play a game where they're really on top for really the entire season. I mean, even the week 1, while they were targeted by Cody, and would have been in a precarious spot had it not been for dependent protection. Even then, he would have survived. I mean, the votes would have been exactly the same as what happened with Christmas. To where beyond that, they're in this really dominant position from that point forward, really holding control of the game for really the rest of their run, where Paul pretty much gets everything they want across that season, facing almost no adversity throughout that entire season, to where even though there is the Jessica HOH, probably the only point where they face any true adversity, they're still able to avoid the block somehow and get them to put up Ramses and have him as an easy scapegoat there. Their running of the end game is very impressive, to where Paul builds down all the pairings in the game in a very impressive way, to where he even gains the trust of Christmas and Josh to the point where both of them were going to take them to the end over each other by the end. And all that is, again, very impressive gameplay. The issue is jury management. Their jury management on BB19 is terrible, and a lot of that comes from the fact that they didn't know the game particularly well. They didn't take the time to research the game, and again, that's their own fault, but I do feel like had they just been somewhat better at jury management, they would have won the game. And even then, again, it's still a 5-4 vote, extremely close there, and really, I think Paul probably still has other winning scenarios. Mind you, I think they're pretty far back and probably getting to the end against like Raven and Matt, or even potentially against Jason and Alex. That obviously takes away a vote that was against him on the jury and puts on Josh would vote for them. So I mean, like, there were winning scenarios, and to be fair, I mean, the Alex and Jason one would have been one that would have been very difficult to actually assess, but still, it's a very, very impressive BB19 game. Their BB18 game, not as much. I think Paul's BB18 game is pretty mediocre, to be honest. I mean, it's one where they're on the bottom for early portion of the season. They're able to recover from that through their relationship with Paulie, and we're very much benefited from the return of Victor, though even then, they make a move against Paulie, and they were the one to take the fall immediately following that, though it ends up winning specific competitions at the right time. That really allows them to navigate through the end of the game, and to be fair, I mean, they end up building a bond with, like, Nicole and Corey by the end of the game, but even then, they end up turning on them, to where, again, like, Paul's game on BB18, not particularly good, one where they're on the bottom for most of it, and doesn't have much control over that game, and is simply just squeaking on by through comp wins, and also makes a fatal mistake at the end by taking Nicole instead of James, who they would have easily beat. So again, like, Paul's game in 18, not particularly good, but their 19 game is one that is, again, truly elite. So that's obviously what puts them so high on this list here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to a player that, again, I look at kind of similarly to Paul, at least on paper, of having one extremely dominant game, while another not as much, but still okay game. And that person is obviously Tyler Crispin from BB's 20 and 22. And again, Tyler's 20 game is one of the best games ever played, especially for a non-winning game. I mean, it's a very, very impressive game where very early on he joins the level 6 alliance and is able to really navigate them through the game in a very impressive way. Again, he's able to flip Caitlyn over to really took control of the numbers, while also manipulates Caitlyn into taking out the leader of her own alliance the following week, which is insane. And then following that, despite not being in power, he's still able to have leverage over the vote, to where, while it's really a choice between two of his allies, he does keep the better of those allies for him in Brett. And then obviously he gets nominated by the hacker, though even then, even if he went out there, it would have been due to a twist, but even then obviously survives there. No, too, for the hacker did benefit him the following week, where Angela or Casey would have probably gone there, but he's able to save them with the veto. But obviously they're able to get Rockstar out instead. But following that, again, he's pretty much on cruise control. He's in this position where he doesn't need to do anything. He already has the game fully set up for him, to where he has a final 2 with Casey. He has Angela wanting to take him to the end due to their romantic relationship. He has a final 2 with Brett. He has a final 2 with Sam. He has a final 2 with JC. He essentially gets to the final 6 in a position to where he's guaranteed final 2 by that point and has numerous winning scenarios. Again, I do think he probably beats Sam. I think he definitely beats Angela, and I think he probably beats Brett as well, to where he beats the majority of the people he was in the end game with. The insane part is that he actually gets to the final 3 of the 2 people he won't win against, which is obviously an issue there. But again, even then against Casey, he almost does win. He pulls over Haley's vote the last second, and had he had more time, I do think he could have pulled over another. Now again, there is definitely flaws to be had in his end game. Again, the fact that he didn't fight more for Angela, the fact that he didn't try to win the veto at final 4 to cut Casey from the game, and even then, like, never was even considering cutting Casey, which is definitely a flaw there. But still, I think his BB20 game is one of the most impressive I've ever seen. I mean, an extremely dominant game. However, his 22 game is not as much. And again, that is a game where I do think you do have to factor in a couple things. Obviously, the fact that there was a massive target on his back. Obviously, he was looked at as one of the best players coming into that season, and through that, I do think that did elevate the target on his back that made some people not want to work with him, particularly Janelle and Kaser. That, again, is a detriment to their game, but also was a detriment to Tyler's game, as it kind of forced him to work with the committee, a position that he wasn't as secure in. But even beyond that, I do feel like you have to consider the fact that he didn't even want to be there. And despite him wanting to quit the game and telling people to vote him out, he still doesn't get taken out and still actually makes it all the way to final 6 with still win equity by that point, which is actually pretty insane. That even in a game where he wasn't even trying and didn't even want to be there, he still makes it to final 6. Now, even like taking that out, there still is sloppy play from him on that season, and he still does get outplayed by Cody, but I still think as a whole, his game is still not entirely bad there. But again, his placement on this list is largely backing off his very, very impressive BB20 appearance. So for me, again, it's enough to put him here at number 8. Now, number 7, we're moving on to a player that I definitely think you can argue should be lower on this list, probably around the spot that someone like a Drew is, as I do think as players, they are very similar. However, I think this person's winning game is a little bit better. So that's why at number 7, I do have Hayden Moss. And again, Hayden is a player that, again, like Drew, is a very well-rounded player. He's a player that I think is very good physically, obviously wins a lot of competitions. He is pretty good socially. Most people liked him, and also had a strategic mind. However, I do think he had more of a strategic mind than Drew, where Drew, I think he had to kind of like lean on a lot of other people to do the strategy for him and made some misguided plays at points. I feel like Hayden is a decent strategic player. I mean, obviously, he did lean on Matt Hoffman to really lead the brigade in their strategy, but beyond that, again, like he does lead the charge against Matt. At the final 7, he really does take control of the game from that point forward, to where, again, I think Hayden's game as a whole is, again, I think Hayden definitely has more of a killer instinct than the likes of Drew, to where that is the reason he's higher on this list, along with the fact that he was in a dominant alliance from the very beginning. I mean, Hayden is essentially as if like Drew was in the Four Horsemen. The Four Horsemen ran things from beginning to end. However, obviously Hayden is in the Brigade, which obviously does run things and does it in a very impressive way. Again, a very innovative way for the time, and having all these separate parachute alliances. And despite being the first HOH and targeting Brennan and Rachel, they for some reason don't target him back, which is pure insanity there. And like really as a whole, I do think Hayden is a very, very impressive player. And to be fair, we've also backed this up by seeing him on Survivor, to where, while again, I definitely have more qualms with his Survivor game than his Big Brother game, it still does show a level of consistency in him being able to do again pretty much the same thing again, where again, if Hayden were to play again, I think he would do extremely well. Though a qualm to be had is the fact that he again only wins in a 4-3 vote, though to be fair, supposedly the Brennan and Rachel votes were due to a misunderstanding, but still, I mean, like, not the optimal play. He should have taken Enzo. Again, I think he would have beaten Enzo even easier there, but still, I do think Hayden is a very impressive player as a whole, very well-rounded player, and because of that, for me, he's here number 7. Now, number 6, we're moving on to a person that I've actually moved down on this list, and it's someone that I'm sure so many people are going to be upset at this person being as low as he is, but screw it, I'm doing it anyway. At number 6, I do have Dr. Will, BB2 and BB7, who, again, Dr. Will, I think is a bit overrated in the grand scheme of things. While I do think he is a very savvy player for sure, I still have a lot of issues with his games. I mean, his BB2 game in particular, I don't think is even that good. I think it's one where, while it is obviously like a very innovative game, it is one where, again, it's the first winning game of the social strategy game of Big Brother. He still is playing a game that is very reliant on that specific format. It's one that isn't very adaptable to the modern day, and while again at the end of the day he plays the game that he was handed, I do think when in comparison to the players that did play in the modern day and play very well in the modern day, I think there is something to take into consideration. And even considering that he's still someone that's on the bottom for a lot of that season, again, due to his own poor play of him acting super cocky early on that made him a massive target on the board, and he gets very lucked out in the fact that Shannon makes herself an even bigger target by the time that she goes home, where he was the target coming into that week. Also getting fortunate that Krista wins the week 2 HOH, to where she was playing the middle. And to fair, again, I do think he does good things to lessen his threat level. I do think he starts to throw comps towards the middle of the game. I do think he starts to make these deals that he never planned on going through with. And again, I think that is a very impressive play by that point, but even then, he never has much power over the game. He's simply being dragged along by Hardy and Nicole. And while again, you could say that, oh, it's because he's doing really good work with them, which I mean, he is, but it's also because he just actually isn't that big of a threat anyway. He's not winning these comps. He never wins a comp. We're literally the only competition he ever wins in all of Big Brother is the comp to make it to part 3 of the final HOH, which he then proceeds to lose also. And again, yes, he was throwing comps, but I don't think he actually is that big of a comp threat to begin with. And again, even his win on BB2 though is one where again he wins because he goes to the end against Nicole. However, I think he loses if he goes to the end against Monica. I think he loses against a lot of other people on that season because again, people didn't like him throughout most of the season, and people seemed to only like him when they saw him after the show, which again, I do think a lot of his jury management was reliant on people watching him on the show, which is obviously something that people aren't able to do anymore. However, then he comes back for BB7 where again, I think he plays a more impressive game. He is in a more dominant spot for more of that game, but even then I think there's some issues. Again, the fact that by the time the final 4, they are both pretty much just openly telling Janelle and Erica the exact same thing that allows them to compare notes and take them out, that's really dumb. Again, there's many points in that season where he tells people to nominate him, with him being genuine about that, which I think is ridiculous. Like really, I just feel like Will plays the game like a bit too cute. I feel like he obviously is a showman and really plays into that aspect of the show, I think to his detriment at points, but still is a massive jury threat on that season. Where, I mean, if he gets to the end of that season, he is a lock win against pretty much anybody on the cast, so where that is something to definitely prop him up there. So again, while Dr. Will is obviously still a great player, he is still a flawed player, and one that I just do not have any faith in him in the modern game of Big Brother, to where mixing down the fact that I do just find holes in his game, even from the old school days of Big Brother, I do have to have Will here at number 6. Now number 5, and we're at the top 5 of this list finally. Moving on to the only change of my top 10 here, where again, I think every other placement is exactly the same. However, I do actually have a player that has leapfrogged Dr. Will on my list here. Someone that I'm sure there'll be definitely people that are upset that Dr. Will is lower than this person, but I do think this person has really proved himself over and over and over again at this point. And that person is Nicole Franzel. And again, I just feel like Nicole is kind of an expert at just navigating through the game, kind of lessening her threat level and not being targeted by the majority of the house. And again, despite having massive targets on her back, the 2 times she's returned to the game, she both of those times was able to navigate to the end of the game. And then we see on reindeer games where she's once again able to just find herself in the middle of the house in a position where people actively wanted to take her to the end, and she ended up repairing numerous relationships over the course of that season. While again, you could definitely qualm with her like not really owning her game and probably being a bit too loyal to her closest ally, again, the fact that she was able to play 3 times now, make deep runs on all 3 of those seasons, and her last 2 seasons in particular being very impressive games, I think is definitely something to give her a lot of credit for. I mean, her first game, again, is a bit rocky. She's not really in the main power structure, but even beyond that, I mean, like, she is playing, like, fine for someone that isn't in that majority group. So again, there was a point where her and Hayden had convinced Derek and Cody to side with them over the likes of Frankie and Christine, which is pretty good play there, though, again, it doesn't follow through. Obviously 22, again, she does lose at the end. Again, I think she's too loyal to Cody throughout all that season. But again, it's still a very impressive game where she's in the committee alliance. She's in this alliance that dominates the game from beginning to end. All while being, again, a former winner and someone that had a massive target on their back coming into the season. Where, again, I think the way that Nicole is able to navigate that season is very impressive. And then we get her 18 game, which I think is actually very, very good. So while she does lose control in the middle when Paulie goes home, really the rest of her game is very impressive. Again, being well positioned early on, being really in the center of most alliances there. Well, then after Paulie goes, again, I think she does very impressive work in getting the likes of James, Natalie, Michelle to turn on Paul while keeping James in line to end up taking out Victor over Corey. And then following that, again, she pretty much rides the middle pretty well. Now, I do think there are points where she is tempted to stay loyal to Paul and Victor in a spot where Corey has to convince her out of that. But still, I do think the way they play that portion of the game is very impressive, playing the sides against each other. And even then, at the final 4, again, she is looked at as less of a target than Corey, to where Corey gets taken out over her. And then she's somehow able to get Paul to take her to the end in a position where she beats him, which is all very impressive as well. Where, and like, I think her BB18 game is a very, very good one. And considering her BB22 game is also a pretty decent one as well. One where, again, she could have potentially won had she gotten to the end against anybody but Cody in that end game. I think those are 2 pretty good games. And I think there is a lot to like about Nicole Franzel's game. So again, the more and more time goes on, the higher and higher I get on Nicole, where again, I actually debated on putting her potentially at number 4 on this list. However, I just feel like none of her games have been as strong as the person I do have at number 4, but still Nicole plays a seemingly consistent game of survival every single time she plays, has won a season of Big Brother, gotten 3rd place, won reindeer games, while also her first run on the game being one that in itself still made a somewhat deep run. So again, I think Nicole Franzel has obviously an incredible track record, and that's why she's here at number 5. Now, number 4, we're moving on to a player that I think my estimations of this person goes up and up over time, to where there was even a point in making this list I debated putting this person all the way at number 2. But for me, the main sticking point of this person is the fact that they've only played once, and we really haven't seen their strategy be enacted a second time around, where I do think because of that there's a little bit of worry in terms of this person's consistency, and that person is Andy. And again, for me, I think Andy plays one of the most impressive games ever played on Big Brother. It is a game that is perfectly suited to Big Brother, this game where you have to be good with everyone, and through that I think he plays a near flawless game, one that he is good with everyone throughout that entire season, is never targeted throughout the entire season, is only nominated once on that season, and even then, again, wasn't the target during that time, and even then that was a spot where he was nominated after the veto. So I think Andy plays an extremely impressive game of him really just expertly navigating through the game and building these really good relationships with pretty much everyone in the house, having multiple alliances that are keeping him safe, again being tied to the Helen and Alyssa side of things, him being connected to the Amanda McRae side of things, and realizing that he needs to cut both of those sides by the end, where he forms the Exterminators towards the end of the game and ends up running the back portion of the game, and even then was a major decision maker even before that, to where again he was a major reason why Nick ends up going home. He was a major influence in why Judd has a target on his back. Or again, I think Andy does play a very, very impressive BB15 game. However, we've only seen him play once. And for me, that is probably the biggest qualm with putting him higher on the list, is the fact that I do feel like his strategy is one that is a bit untested. I feel like I would probably need to see him play again and be able to do the same thing again to really give him a higher spot on this list, though I think he's someone that is in contention to be the best player of all time in my mind if he were to play again and do a very similar thing again and get to the end of the game again, where I don't think it's impossible for someone to overtake my number 1 spot on this list. I feel like it is one where if we have another impressive winner come back to the game and play another very impressive game, I think there's definitely a shot that they overtake the number 1 spot. So again, I think Andy is someone that if that were to ever happen, which again probably won't, but if it were to ever happen, I think he could be the number 1 player of all time. But for me, it's just because again, he's only played once, his game's a bit untested, he never really had to play from the bottom. It's a bit tough to put him much higher here than number 4. Now number 3, we're moving on to a player that definitely went up a lot after his latest season, where, to be fair, I never looked at him as that bad of a player, even though again some people called him the dumbest player of all time. I think he played a very impressive first game, but his second game is obviously truly elite, and that person is Cody Calafiore from BB16 and 22, where again his 22 game is one of the most dominant games ever played, where despite the fact that he was being targeted at points, he was never really in any danger until the final 4 round, where he could have been sniped out of the game. But outside that, again, was in a very strong dominant position for most of the game, though again, like, I do think he has the same issue as like an Andy in the fact that we never got to see him play from the bottom. He never faced any true adversity through that season, with the committee just winning comp after comp after comp, and through that, again, like, he was just in a very good position throughout the entirety of it, while again getting people to do what he wanted them to do, again building the strong connection with like Nicole and Enzo, and had them work together to get the final 3, where he was guaranteed final 2 and essentially guaranteed the win. He also had really good relations with the likes of Danny and Tyler and Memphis that had them wanting to keep him around. He just plays an extremely dominant game on 22, while on 16, again, his game is also like not that bad, where again if he just had a bit more of a killer instinct and been willing to cut Derek at the end, again he wins that game. Even without that, I think he plays a very impressive game, where his navigation through the game alongside Derek is really impressive, where again, like, I do think there are the issues, the fact that Derek does undercut him along the way, and Derek is the bigger jury threat by the end of it, but Cody again was not a slouch either. Again, Cody did participate in the decision making, he did do some of the legwork. Now at the end of the day, again, Derek was better positioned, again that's why Cody is on the block multiple times, that's why Cody doesn't go on to win the game. But I do think Cody is someone that played a pretty impressive BB16 game as well, until he made the one bad decision at the very end. Now obviously he was on Reindeer Games, it didn't go particularly great, though at the same time I don't really fault him too much for how that run went, where again he was obviously looked at as a massive challenge threat coming into it, and again, him being the consensus target for most of the house makes a lot of sense considering his legacy in the show, to where even despite that, I don't feel like he necessarily plays poorly, even though he was on the bottom the entire time. But for me, it doesn't really change that much of how I really view his game, especially considering I do feel like most of the times he plays Big Brother, he is on the top most of the time, just due to his inherent strategy of getting all the big comp threats together and making them stick together in a solid alliance, as he's done 2 times now. Again, considering his BB22 game, which is extremely dominant, and the fact that he is just such a great all-around player, again, very good at all aspects of the game, again, very competent strategically. So again, he's one of the few players that I remember listening to his deep dive, and just being pretty surprised at the fact that he was as methodical in the game as he was, while again, being extremely dominant in challenges, and again, being very good socially, to where again, for me, Cody is a very great all-around player, but is not higher simply because we didn't see him face adversity, and also saw him lost to a certain other person who's above him, to where because that for me, he is here number 3. Now number 2, and again, the top 2 should be kind of obvious, along the actual placements of them as well. At number 2, I do have Derek. And Derek for me is, again, a little bit tough to rank here in the sense that he is a one-time player, never faced any adversity, which again is my qualm with the likes of Andy. And again, on paper, you'd think Cody would be above him because he's a 2-time player that did it twice. However, for me, Derek is above Cody for a couple of reasons. Obviously, the fact that he does beat Cody on their initial season, that's obviously a major reason. But really, I think a bigger reason for me is that I think Derek really changed the meta of the game. I think he is this person that kind of broke the game. He recognized the optimal strat for Big Brother and building this alliance that has all the comp competitors, to where if that alliance ends up sticking together, you should be able to just easily steamroll the game. And he was able to do that while also building really strong relationships with everyone in that alliance, to where he was extremely safe in the game while also probably beating everybody at the end of the game. So again, his dominance on that season is pretty unprecedented. Now, I think there are some qualms to have with his game, and the fact that I do think he gets lucked out by certain situations. Again, the Battle of the Block is a twist that very much benefits him in the game. The Team America twist is one that also makes it more likely for the likes of Frankie and Donnie to not consider backstabbing him. Also, the Rewind week is one where it allows him to take out Frankie at the final 5, which is very beneficial to him. Or again, I think Frankie was still going to take him towards the end of the game, but it would have put him in a much more precarious spot. And again, like, definitely Derek does luck out at certain situations, but again, still the pure dominance of his game is nearly unprecedented. And considering, again, his massive win equity at the end, his lack of being targeted, also, like, again, him manipulating Victoria into doing whatever he wanted, him getting Cody to take him to the end, him having the likes of Beast Mode Cowboy wanting to take him to the end, Frankie wanted to take him to at least the final 3. I mean, again, like, so many people were taking Derek so far in the game, despite the fact that he had such massive win equity. Considering how much control he had throughout really the entirety of the game, for me, again, Derek is a really great player that lands here at number 2. Now, number 1, the best player of all time, again, shouldn't have to be explained here. It is Dan Gheesling. And Dan is a player that I, again, have very little issues with Dan as a player. I mean, with his specific games, again, there's things to call out. Obviously, BB10, he is on the outs at the very beginning because Brian Hart gets blindsided and he has to recover from that. But again, he does recover from that and does so very well. Now, I do think his like replacement nominee roulette was probably a bit cute, where I get the point of it, but it also probably was unnecessary. But even then, I think his final 5 round, I think you could qualm with as well, where had it not been for him or Memphis winning the veto, I think there's a good chance that Dan goes home there. But I mean, really, the rest of his game, again, is very impressive. The way he navigates through the game is very impressive. The way he's able to lessen his threat level and build social capital is very impressive. The way he manages the jury is extremely impressive, with him being a master at jury management on BB10, which is funny what happens at BB14, but still his BB14 game as well is also very impressive. I mean, to be fair, again, early on, he is obviously a coach, and obviously through that has some wonky circumstances early on, but still should have been this massive target in the game. Again, and yeah, despite that, again, no one really came for Dan for most of the season. It wasn't until Frank won HOH at Final 8 that someone finally comes from him, but even then, obviously, we have Dan's funeral and him convincing Frank to blindside Brittany instead, which is all a pretty insane move. But again, his navigation of the endgame is very impressive, where again, he faces so much adversity, where the comps go completely all wrong for him over and over and over again, where while he is able to get Frank out, he then targets Ian. Ian wins the veto. He then wants to take out Shane, which, to be fair, he backs out on. And again, you could definitely qualm with that. But at Final 5, Ian wins HOH, Shane wins veto. Again, he can't take them out once again, and is forced to take out Jen, probably one of his few potential winning scenarios. But at 4, he obviously pulls off the insane move of taking out Shane, and again, somehow still gets both Danielle and Ian to throw the final HOH part 1 to him, and makes it to the final 2 again, only to then lose that time. Though, again, I don't really fault him that much for that loss, as, again, he was someone that they weren't going to vote for coming into the season, where they were openly talking about at the very beginning of the season how they weren't going to allow a winner to win again. And while, yeah, I think you could definitely qualm with how he handled some of the jury members, I don't really fault him that much for that loss. And really, Dan's a player that has shown that he can play from the top and bottom. He has played from a dominant position at points in both of his seasons, while also playing from the bottom on both of his seasons. seasons, facing a lot of adversity and overcoming that both times. Again, winning in a very dominant fashion on BB10 while also being a runner-up, also in a dominant fashion in BB14. Again, Dan has demonstrated pretty much all the skills you would want from a Big Brother player, but again, I don't think he's unbeatable. Again, I do think if someone played 2 very impressive games, at least one of them being a winning game, also showing them face a lot of adversity, again, I do think there are ways that Dan can be beaten in this list, but as of right now, his spot is pretty secure, with him really showing all the skills that you would want from a Big Brother player, while also having a pretty insane track record as well. So because of that, for me, he is here number 1. But there we go. That is my ranking of all 312 players of Big Brother US. This was ridiculous. This is definitely a ranking that went on for even longer than I even anticipated, to where this is obviously a massive one marked off the list, to where, again, I thought this was the perfect timing after BB25 and also the 5-year anniversary of the channel, where, again, thank you to everyone that's still watching my channel. I don't know how this channel even got any traction to begin with, but again, just insanity that I've been doing this for 5 years, to where as of right now, I still plan on continuing on. Again, I very much doubt that this can go on forever, but I still don't have plans on stopping just yet, along with the fact that, again, I'll be doing bigger rankings like this for the years to come as well, where I already have plans to do one next year for Australian Survivor, and I will be doing one for Survivor US after Survivor 50, which has been the plan for literally years now, and it's one that I just don't even know how I'm going to do that, considering how massive this ranking is, and that list will have over double the amount of people, but we'll get to that when that eventually comes. But with that, I've now officially ranked every player that played the social strategy game of Big Brother US. For obviously down the road, expect more of the same type of videos you can expect from the channel, more bigger rankings, more reality TV content, some video game content. Just expect more of the same sort of stuff you're seeing on the channel. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.